where are you going to sit? Never. Thank you.
Can just start our proceedings today. You're all very welcome to the Wood Quay Venue of Dublin City Council. I'm Dr. Caoimhe Whelan. I'm a medieval historian based at Trinity Longham Hub, the Arts and Humanities Research Institute of Trinity College Dublin, and I'm the Honours Secretary of the Friends of Medieval Dublin. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this, one of our first in-person events in a very long time. And we are delighted to be joined for this event by the Deputy Lord Mayor of Dublin, Councillor Joe Costello, and the Lord Mayor of Bristol, Steve Smith. It's an honour to have both of you here today to mark the changing but long-standing relationship between Dublin and Bristol. And we're going to hear about some of that today from our expert speakers. In session one, Professor Seán Duffy from Trinity College Dublin will talk about Bristol and the conquest of Dublin. Dr. Grace O'Keefe from Trinity will tell us about Bristolian residents of Dublin. In session 2, Professor Mary-Therese Flanagan from Queen's will present on Henry II and Ireland, and Professor Nicholas Vincent of East Anglia will close out the seminar with a talk about Henry II's charter, a replica of which is on display here today and was of course used on our poster to advertise the seminar. The Deputy Lord Mayor will open the event for us in a moment and say a few words, but before I invite him to do so, I just have a few points of housekeeping. I see there are plenty of regulars here today who will be familiar with the venue, but for those of you who don't know about the Friends of Medieval Dublin, we are a non-profit research, study and heritage group dedicated to the preservation and conservation of Dublin's medieval heritage, and we hold public events throughout the year. In pre-pandemic days, we held our annual symposium in Trinity in May. Last year, we were delighted to participate in the Dublin Festival of History programme in the autumn, and we hope to do so again this year, so you can watch out for that. In terms of this venue, there are 3 fire exits from this space, back up the main stairs the way you came in, out the courtyard fire door, which is located at the end of the city wall, into the courtyard and the external fire stairs, out the large oak door at the end of the room through the double fire doors, and out along the corridor out of the building. Should a fire alarm go off during the course of this event, make your way calmly to the nearest exit and vacate without delay. Don't go searching for personal belongings or attempt to remove equipment. Don't use the lift. And there's a disabled refuge outside the courtyard fire door and through the large oak door and double doors at the end of the room should you need it. And head out to the venue, turn left onto Wine Tavern Street and walk approximately 50 yards up the hill and assemble on the raised passageway known as Viking Square, which is appropriate. And you'll be kept updated by the staff when it's safe to return. But hopefully we won't have to deal with any of that. Our 2 sessions today are going to be 1 hour and 15 minutes with a break for tea and coffee in the middle. We'll hear from 2 speakers and we'll have time for questions at the end of each session. And you'll be invited to ask your question. The chair will summarise for the audience and for our live stream. We are being recorded, as I'm sure most of you know. We're live streaming to Facebook via the Dublin City Library's YouTube channel. Thanks to Dave, our videographer, for that. And we just ask that you keep your face coverings on for the duration of the event and mute your telephones. I'm sure there are plenty tweeters here, so do send plenty of tweets using the hashtag Dublin Bristol 850, a tweet at FN Dublin and at DUBCILIB. So I would love now to introduce the Deputy Lord Mayor of Dublin, Joe Costello, to officially open our seminar series. So I invite him to make his remarks.
Thank you very much, Caoimhe, and good afternoon, everybody. And it is a great honour and privilege for me to be here deputising for the Lord Mayor of Dublin, Alison Gilliland, who unfortunately can't be here, and to welcome you all here today, and particularly to welcome our visitors from across the Channel. Steve Smith, the Lord Mayor of Bristol. It would be foolish of me, really, in front of Professor Duffy and our other distinguished speakers and such an audience as yourself, to attempt to tell the story of the granting of the Charter by King Henry II of Dublin to his men of Bristol. Notice he didn't grant it to his women of Bristol, he granted it to his men of Bristol. And of course, these were all knights that had come from Wales at the time. But I was a little bit worried when I saw that the Lord Mayor from Bristol was coming, considering that it took us 750 years to get it back from the men of Bristol, that he was going to try and enforce the Charter all the time, but I'm sure that's not going to happen at this stage. Look, I'm very happy to be here, and it's important for the City of Dublin to mark this historic occasion. And something as historic as the granting of the first Charter, and that's of the City of Dublin. There are so many other charters, over 100, that have come subsequently. They have so much significance for the city's development, and indeed other cities in Ireland, and how the story of Ireland has unfolded over the decades and the centuries. The coming of the Normans to Ireland, or the Norman invasion, as we called it, was of course a seminal event, perhaps the seminal event in the history of this country. Nothing would ever be the same again. And the capture of Dublin by the Normans brought an end to the Hiberno-Norse period and began Dublin's position as the country's royal administrative centre. The castle, of course, was erected. That was the very first thing that the Normans did, was to build a castle for security and for administrative purposes. But Professor Duffy tells me that the walls here preceded that by about 70 years. These were actually built by the Vikings to keep the Normans out. They weren't successful at the time, unfortunately, or whichever way you want to look at it. We had two sets of invaders, and you can weigh them up as to which you think were best. So this has remained the seat of English administration in Ireland until 1922. And in fact, that event was commemorated only a few weeks ago, the War of Independence and the signing of the treaty and the end of that period, that long period of 750 years of Norman and English rule in Ireland. So the Henry II Charter is of course important in its own right, but it's also important to Dublin as the oldest of the 102 charters held in the city archives. In a sense, it is the foundation document of the archives. Charters were very important documents which needed to be kept safe, and indeed the keeping of records was itself a sign of Dublin becoming a self-governing municipality. That we still have the original charters and other records such as the Guild Roll, the White Book of Dublin and the Chain Book are due to the care and attention shown by generations of council officials. And yet, strangely enough, our city archives as a dedicated service date only to 1979, when Dr. Mary Clark was appointed as the first city archivist. Originally based in City Hall in what is now the supper room, where councillors gather before meetings, the archives moved to the City Assembly House, then the Civic Museum, in 1984. The service continued to develop there until a dedicated reading room and specialised archival storage was provided in 2003 as part of the redevelopment of Pearse Street Library. That we have such an excellent archive service is due in large part to the work of Dr. Mary Clark, supported by successive city librarians. Mary unfortunately retired in January 2021, and although she can't be here with us today, I want certainly to acknowledge her wonderful contribution to the city and to the preservation of its records, and her commitment to making those records more accessible to researchers and to the public at large. Keeping archival records safe is fundamental, but so is the carrying out of research into all these records. This afternoon's seminar features 4 experts who have done much to tell the story of Henry II's visit to Ireland in 1771-1772 and his granting Dublin to his men of Bristol. And I want to congratulate them and thank them for bringing the fruits of the research to us today. I already mentioned Professor Seán Duffy from Trinity College Dublin, and he is accompanied by his colleague Dr. Grace O'Keefe, also from Trinity College Dublin, and Professor Teresa Flanagan of Queen's University Belfast, and Professor Nicholas Vincent from the University of East Anglia. They will all be contributing to making major contributions to our seminar this afternoon. This seminar, of course, can't happen without there being a host, and it has been presented by the Friends of Medieval Dublin. And I want to commend them on their dedicated work in uncovering Dublin's past and bringing it to life for Dubliners and visitors alike. And we know all about that history and all the good work that has been done over many decades by the Friends of Medieval Dublin. As we emerge from the pandemic, we will gladly say goodbye to the many restrictions that came in its wake. But one of the things that will remain is the holding of events online. The shift to online events has brought a whole new audience for many organisations, including our city libraries and archives. Talks which might have attracted maybe 50 people in a branch library attract audiences 10 times that online and allow for people to participate who would otherwise miss out. So there has been good and bad things about COVID, but it's great to see such a crowd here today. It's the first big outing that I've been at. that actually, we can really participate in what is almost a normal matter, what was a normal matter, but hasn't been so for almost 2 years. I'm delighted to find that this seminar this afternoon is being live streamed, and I want to extend a welcome to all those joining us online from wherever you are in the world. I know that some of the online audience are in Bristol, a city whose connections with Dublin continued long after Henry's charter. One connection of many is that of Dubliner Edmund Burke, the famous statesman who was born on Arran Quay, served as an MP for Bristol for several years, and so there are statues of Edmund Burke adorning both our cities. So perhaps this is a good time, considering what's happening around us, to reflect on the quotation that is attributed to Edmund Burke. Those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. So can I say in conclusion that it is a great pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to be able to come here to welcome you, to open this seminar today, and to have our discussion, our debate, and our conclusions on a tale of two cities, Dublin and Bristol. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone here and online. And thank you very much, Deputy Lord Mayor, Councillor Joe Costello, for your remarks and for getting us started today. My name is Sparky Booker. I am a friend of medieval Dublin, and I recognise many of your faces from our events over the years. So it's wonderful to welcome you back to this wonderful venue, the Wood Quay Venue. I am going to be chairing our first panel of all of our four fantastic speakers today. The format for this panel is that we'll have both papers and then questions at the end. So, if you have a question that occurs to you as our first speaker is speaking, just note it down or be sure to remember it for after our second paper. Our first speaker is known to many of you. He really, in this venue and with this crowd, probably requires no introduction, but just in case you aren't familiar with him and his work already, Seán Duffy is Professor of Medieval Irish and Insular History at Trinity College, Dublin, and his scholarly research is really remarkably and impressively wide-ranging. So he's published important volumes on Brian Boru and the Battle of Clontarf, on the Bruce brothers in Ireland, and he's also published things I'm particularly grateful for, a history of medieval Ireland that is short enough that even the less keen undergraduates might read it cover to cover. So I urge you to check that out if you're interested in a history, a narrative of the whole of Irish medieval history. But his interest in the history of this city has been one of the most enduring aspects of his scholarship. And he has contributed immensely to it, not only with his own publications on various aspects of Dublin's past, but also as chairman of the Friends of Medieval Dublin since 1998. So his 25th year anniversary in that role, I believe, is coming up, if my maths are correct. And also as editor of the Medieval Dublin series, which is the proceedings of the Medieval Dublin Symposium that the Friends run normally each spring, last year and this coming year in September as part of the History Festival. Today, Seán is going to tell us about Bristol and the Anglo-Norman conquest of Dublin. Over to you, Seán.
Many thanks indeed, Sparky, for those lies you told about me. I share everyone else's delight to be back with you. I have no idea how I get from that to my PowerPoint. That's the only thing that we haven't sorted out. And there we go. I fill the interval in while we're waiting by just reiterating the thanks we've already heard to the Lord Mayor of Bristol for joining us today, but precedence must go, of course, to our own Deputy Lord Mayor, Councillor Joe Costello, and it's a great privilege for him to be here with us also. Now, and before I forget, because when you're chairing things like this, you thank everyone else and you never get thanked. So Dr. Caoimhe Whelan, who started the ball rolling today, will end the ball rolling today, and I am incredibly grateful to her for her work in getting this thing, in helping this thing happen today. So I want to acknowledge that now. And I know we're all sick of anniversaries and commemorations, so it doesn't do to have another one, but the Deputy Lord Mayor did mention the event just a couple of weeks ago to mark the centenary of the handing over of Dublin Castle by British forces just exactly 100 years ago. And there was a very dignified ceremony held, I must say, to mark the occasion. But I noticed in watching it on the TV and reading about it in the newspapers, there was no commentary at all on how it all began, and the origins of this. I mean, if what happened on the right a century ago there marked the end of something, there had to be a beginning, and that beginning came many centuries earlier, the beginning of the English presence in Dublin. And that's what we're marking today. I mean, it's not a celebration, so even President Higgins would have no qualms about attending it, I think. We're simply marking what was a truly extraordinary development, because 850 years ago, Henry II became the first reigning King of England to set foot on Irish soil. And he spent about 6 months in Ireland, most of that in Dublin. In the winter of 1171-2. And before he left Dublin, he left in late February 1172, I think, so almost exactly 850 years ago today, he issued a charter, as we have been hearing, giving the city away, granting it to the men, as we heard, of Bristol. And that charter is what shaped the future course of the history of Dublin, and it is why we're here today. So it isn't really about whether that was a good thing or that was a bad thing. It was a thing. It was a big thing. It was a big, important event. And so, of course, we need to mark that occasion. And we need to try and understand it, and that's what the speakers have. That's why they have come together here today, and we're incredibly grateful to them for that. It's my job just to sort of set the scene, if you like, by talking about the role of Bristol in the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland and in the conquest of Dublin. So the question is, why Bristol of all places? Well, in the 11th and the 12th centuries, when people thought of Bristol, I don't think you could say the same for the 21st century. But in the 11th, in the 12th, when people thought of Bristol, they thought of Ireland. And they thought specifically of its connections with Ireland. In fact, the very first mention of Bristol in the Great Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, I've jotted it down there, it records this very phenomenon. It's a mention of Harold Godwinson. This is the famous Harold who was killed at the Battle of Hastings, going to Bristol and ultimately taking ship for Ireland. And there's lots of similar mentions like that, which attest to this connection. And in the 1120s, or it might be the early 1130s, a famous English writer, William of Malmesbury, wrote one of his great works, which was a life of St. Wulfstan, the famous Bishop of Worcester. And in that book, William says of Bristol that it is a maritime town from which is a direct course to Ireland. The inhabitants of this town, with other persons from England, often sail to Ireland for the sake of merchandise. And one of the biggest items, to be frank, of merchandise that exchanged between the two was slaves. St. Wulfstan, this man here, St. Wulfstan, was famous, is most famous for his opposition to the slave trade. Human enslavement existed at this time. By the late 11th century, it was becoming unpopular in England, but it was certainly still practiced in Ireland. And it fed into the emerging stereotype of Ireland as a place that was out of step, that was backward, that it was inhabited by barbarians who deserved to be conquered and needed to be civilized and so on. And that ultimately is what led to the Anglo-Norman invasion to a considerable extent. Now, as you know, the developments that would culminate in the English conquest of Ireland, they probably began from the moment that Henry II became King of England. This is the man that granted the charter that we're commemorating today. And in 1154, he became King of England. I mean, the circumstances, they're all, needless to say, complex and controversial, but it is certainly the case that in the immediate aftermath of him becoming king, John of Salisbury, the secretary of the Archbishop of Canterbury, was sent to Rome to try and find evidence for Ireland's, the subordination of the Irish Church to that of England. There was a new pope at that time, the one and only Englishman ever to be pope. Nicholas Breakspear became Pope Adrian, and he issued the famous bull, as we often refer to it, bull Laudabilitor, a letter called Laudabilitor. And Henry is certainly said to have called a major council of all of his ministers and the great barons of state to the city of Winchester in 1155, specifically to discuss the prospect of a conquest of Ireland. So it was on the agenda, certainly. We'll be hearing a great deal more about Henry and Ireland later on from Professor Flanagan. We know that Henry did have dealings with Ireland. It can sometimes be hard to find. A lot of this is very subterranean, but if you read in between the lines, there are indications of his connections. Henry was a famous conqueror, of course. He conquered places other than Ireland, and in 1166 he was attempting to conquer Wales, and he launched a major invasion of Wales. So he was coming from the east with his land armies, and that was to coincide with a major invasion from the west that would have seen fleets going from the main ports on the east coast of Ireland. They are mainly Dublin, Wexford and Waterford in that age. And he recruited them, and presumably it was the fact that they didn't arrive in sufficient numbers that caused him to have to abandon his proposed conquest of Wales at that time. That's what the Brut Tuasagion, the Welsh annals, say about the whole affair. But those towns that Henry recruited in 1165, if they're Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, they were under the control of that man that all of us have heard much of over the years, the famous or infamous Diarmaid MacMurrough, who was the over-king of Leinster in that period. So if he was the overlord of those towns, he must have been at least an ally of Henry's in 1165. And it was only a matter of months after that that Diarmaid MacMurrough himself was forced to flee from Ireland when his subordinate lords rebelled against him. And his first port of call was Bristol. And from Bristol, he sought out Henry II in Aquitaine. It's a well-known story told to us by Gerald of Wales, the famous Geraldus Cambrensis. He says that there Diarmaid swore an oath of fealty to King Henry. He got a promise of assistance from Henry, and then he returned to Bristol. This is the exact quotation in translation from Gerald of Wales. He travelled to the noble town of Bristol. He spent some time there, supported in fitting style at the public expense, in expectation of the chance visit of ships which, coming from Ireland, had often in the past. So you can see, if what was Bristol in the 1160s. It was the place you go to if you want news from Ireland, and that's partly what MacMurrough is doing there. Now that book, the Expugnatio Hibernica, it's only the second book ever written about Ireland, and the first one was also written by Geraldus, his famous topography of Ireland. The Expugnatio is one of two accounts we have, two main accounts of the Anglo-Norman invasion. The other is a poem in Anglo-Norman French. It's usually called the Song of Dermot and the Earl. And I give you the quotation from it, what it has to say about MacMurrough. The mighty king, King Diarmid that is, had as fine and favourable a wind as he could wish. They set out with a fair wind and land at Bristol. King Diarmid stayed at the house of Robert Herdin, near to St. Austin's, with all the men he had. St. Austin's, by the way, is the famous Abbey of St. Augustine, with all the men he had with him. According to what people say, the Queen was there as well. So this is Diarmid MacMurrough's wife. And when the king, MacMurrough, had stayed for as long as he wished, he had his knights summoned. So apparently Diarmid MacMurrough had knights. And he intended to travel to Normandy to appeal to the powerful King Henry of England. Now, the Robert Herdin, in that account there, he is also a famous individual. He's a man called Robert Fitzharding. He was a merchant in Bristol. He was kind of a property speculator as well. And the fact that Diarmid MacMurrough made a beeline for Bristol is probably because he knew that Fitzharding would provide asylum for him and his entourage. So there was probably a prior acquaintance there. I mean, if you think about Fitzharding as being one of the dominant figures in the Bristol's trade, he would have had dealings with the Irish ports with Dublin and Wexford and Waterford, and obviously with their lord, MacMurrough, at that stage. Now, and this man, Robert Fitzharding, was also a very close acquaintance of Henry II. Henry, incidentally, lived in Bristol for a number of years back in the 1140s, long before he had become king. So what the Song of Diarmid and the Earl tells us next isn't at all surprising, really. It states that when MacMurrough had met up with Henry II in Aquitaine, when he discussed his plight, when he swore fealty to King Henry, and then he returned, it says he returns to Bristol, as Giraldus had done, and these are the exact words of it in translation. He crossed the sea to England. He went to stay at Bristol. King Henry then sent word by letter and by messenger to Robert Herding that as he held him dear, this is as Henry held Diarmid MacMurrough dear, Robert Fitzharding should give everything necessary both to Diarmid himself and to his men, unreservedly, according to his desire, and that he should honourably do all his commands. And the king stayed at Bristol a fortnight or a month, I know not which. Whatever the king asked for, Robert let him have in abundance. So this is quite the state visit that is being depicted here. MacMurrough living it up in the lap of luxury at the public expense, as Gerald of Wales had put it. Now, MacMurrough eventually left Bristol and he went to South Wales, and it is in South Wales that he started recruiting military assistance. And he eventually returned to Ireland in about August 1167. So that's a year after his original exodus. That's why we normally, the numbers that were involved in that, the numbers of fighting men that he had recruited in South Wales, they were very small. So that's why we normally, traditionally, we date the start of the invasion to 1169 rather than 1167. Because it's in 1169, it's around the 1st of May that year that a much larger force of Cambro-Normans, so Normans based in Wales, arrived into Ireland, and they made the famous landing at Bannow Bay, down in County Wexford, led by Robert Fitzstephen, later on by Maurice Fitzgerald, the ancestor of the great Geraldine clan in Ireland. And that made a big difference to MacMurrough, and it turned him into a more formidable figure who was able to win back his ancestral kingdom. But there's one other individual we haven't mentioned yet today that MacMurrough met when he was in Bristol. He's a man called Richard, the son of Gilbert de Clare, who has become known to us as Strongbow. And he was a substantial figure. He claimed the title Earl of Pembroke. He held the lordship of Strigoi, which had its headquarters at Chepstow, just at the Severn estuary there, if you're familiar with that part of the world. He had lordships also in Normandy, but he was out of favour, out of royal favour at that time, and he was down on his luck when he met up with MacMurrough. But it was in Bristol that they met, and it was in Bristol that they hatched a plan. And I know it's a cliche, obviously, to talk about these events as changing the course of Irish history. But that meeting between them, the arrangement that they made, did completely transform Irish history in, forever afterwards. Because the plan was that Strongbow would assist MacMurrough in recovering the overkingship of Leinster, which was fine. But then that Strongbow would succeed to the overkingship of Leinster after MacMurrough, and that's what triggered Henry II's decision to come to Ireland after MacMurrough died, and that's what it's when Henry lay his claim to Ireland himself, that Ireland in effect became a colony of England, which it remained till the 20th century, and is the origins of the still existing United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Now, there's one English chronicler that I always enjoy reading. He's a man called William of Newburgh. And he has an interesting account of Strongbow's coming to Ireland. He describes how Strongbow was impoverished by debt and he was eager for some great undertaking. And therefore he assembled in the territory which was his by right, so that's the Chepstow area, a huge and powerful force of armed men and made ready a fleet to sail over to Ireland. And William of Newburgh then continues by telling us that when Strongbow arrived into Ireland, he decided that he must undertake a bold attack so as to become thereafter an object of fear to the barbarians, that's the Irish. So he made a determined onslaught on Dublin, a maritime city which is the capital of all Ireland, and which rivals our London in the merchandise and provisions handled in its very busy harbour. He stormed and captured it bravely and speedily, compelled numerous people, even those quite far away, to come to terms with him, since they were unnerved with fear. Further, he sought the favour, unimportant though it was, of this barbarian nation by a marriage alliance. He took to wife the daughter of an allied king and obtained as dowry most of the kingdom. And that's, of course, the famous. This is probably not the last time you'll see this famous painting this afternoon. But you can see the real thing up in the National Gallery any time. The famous marriage of Strongbow to MacMurrough's daughter, Aoife. So in other words, starting in 1167, there was a low-key involvement in Ireland by frontiersmen from South Wales. But now, with the intervention and the success of Strongbow, Earl Richard de Clare, the whole thing was converted into a bit of an emergency. You know, the alarm bells were ringing in England, and hence William of Newburgh describes Henry II's anger because Richard had diverted to himself the fame of so splendid an acquisition, when instead it should have been credited to the king as his superior. And Richard, he tells us, was acting virtually as a king, and so King Henry decided that he would have to bring him to heel. And among other things, he wrested from him the most celebrated city of Dublin and other places worth acquiring, bidding him remain content with the rest, i.e. the rest of MacMurrough's kingdom of Leinster. And he describes how King Henry then sailed to Ireland in 1171 with a huge army and terrified the Irish into submission to him. Now, we'll be hearing a lot about that from Professor Flanagan later on. Now, when it came to Henry's, this big expedition to Ireland, Bristol played a much more important role than any other town or city in Britain in terms of the organisation of it. Howard Clark, I don't know whether Howard is with us today, but many years ago he did a fabulous examination of the pipe roll evidence for Henry's expedition. And he showed that Bristol was the collecting centre for the money, and all the monies and the provisions and so on for it. Most of the supplies went through Bristol to Ireland. And I mean, if you think about that expedition, it lasted for upwards of 6 months. It was in a very bad winter. The winter of 1171-2 was incredibly severe by all accounts. So lots of these provisions were required. The sheriff of each English a shire was sent instructions to make purchases and disbursements for the expedition. And the pipe rolls, these things they're part of the exchequer accounting machine. They enable a very precise calculation to be made of both the costs of the purchase and then the relevant county by county breakdown. And Howard Clark did this, and unsurprisingly, Bristol and its hinterland furnished 46% of the expedition's needs in terms of value. So about half the money is coming from the Bristol area. And I say unsurprising because obviously Ireland lies to the west. The king and every one of the vast army that accompanied him were going to be going to ship out westwards with their supplies. And if royal purveyors were going to be buying up food and fodder and all the other things that you need to bring an army, a huge army, to another island, it makes perfect sense to locate those supplies locally, and that's what they did. But part of the consequence of that was that, I mean, it was really, it was organised, as I said, very extensively out of Bristol. It was dependent on the shipping of Bristol, on the manpower from Bristol, and provisions from the general Bristol, Gloucestershire catchment. And so, in a sense, this was the only part of England that could claim some degree of ownership of it. So Henry's expedition, which saw him claim Ireland for the English crown, it meant that this island, I mean, if you think about it, we sometimes, you get so familiar reading these things, you don't sit back and think about it. I mean, Ireland is, it's an island 2/3 the size of England, and yet it suddenly became available for people from England to settle in. Englishmen could go there and they could carve out a future for themselves. And Bristol is the place that was in on this act from the very start. So it is a very important phenomenon. We have surprisingly little information about Henry's doings while he was in Ireland. As I mentioned, he was there for about 6 months. Let me see if I have a slide on this. But this is about this charter that we are looking at today is one of the very few things that we can be absolutely certain about from Henry's visit. We'll be hearing much more about it later on from Professor Vincent. But it was issued here in Dublin, and it begins, as you can see, with those words, "Know that I have granted and conceded, and by the present charter confirmed, to my men of Bristol, my city of Dublin." So Henry therefore granted Dublin to Bristol. And this, I mean, I've been looking at this charter for very many years, but I didn't realize until fairly recently that this is a very unusual event, granting one town to another town. I mean, it's not entirely unprecedented, but it's a very rare thing indeed. But this charter went even further than that, because Henry then adds that he grants his men of Bristol, the city of Dublin, ad inhabitandam, to be inhabited, to inhabit it, to dwell in the city. And he repeats that again, as you can see towards the end there. I will and I command that Dublin shall be inhabited by the men of Bristol. That is very unusual. As I said, Professor Nicholas Vincent, he is the world expert on this. And I'm absolutely thrilled that he's able to be here today, so he can explain it to us later on. But it isn't, I know enough about it to know that it isn't just a license for the men of Bristol to settle in Dublin. The charter states that the Bristolians are to hold Dublin of the king and his heirs, with all the liberties and the free customs that they have in Bristol and throughout all Henry's lands. So how all the inhabitants of one city hold another city, technically, I don't know quite how that works. But in essence, Henry established Dublin as a kind of a dependency of Bristol. Howard Clark once called it a colonial adjunct of Bristol. So the question is, I suppose, is why Henry did it. In some senses, it was a reward for the Bristolians for the past loyalty to him. He had became King of England at the end of the Civil War. After all, so he owed them something. Also, presumably, he's rewarding them for their role in organising the expedition. they could come and live in Dublin. They could be assured that they would have the same rights there, the same laws, the same liberties, the same customs that they had in Bristol, and that was a phenomenal achievement for them. And there's one other thing, I don't quite understand the technicalities of it. Nicholas Vincent probably does. Bristol was technically part of the Earldom of Gloucester. And there was an ongoing tussle between the earldom and the crown for control of the town and for the affections of the burgesses of the town of Bristol. Robert Patterson, when he was writing about it, he called this the Angevin siege of Bristol, using siege metaphorically. So when the crown granted urban financial privileges to Bristol, it was part of this kind of love bombing that it was engaged in. And also, if you think about it from Henry II's point of view, there was a lot to be said for incentivizing Bristolians to come and live in Dublin. Because, the fact is, Dublin, again, we tend to tiptoe around this to an extent. Dublin was violently conquered by Strongbow in the autumn of 1170. I mean, violently conquered. Its previous ruling class were butchered and they were banished from the city. And, there weren't just opportunities, therefore, for a new mercantile community in Dublin. There was a need for some repopulation of the city after the English conquest. And you can imagine how Henry's coffers would gain from that, a whole new batch of taxpayers, but also how it would help to stabilize English rule. The immediate beneficiaries of the charter were the Bristol merchants. You'd almost think that this charter belongs in the archives of the city of Bristol, because on the face of it, the sole beneficiaries are these Bristol merchants. And yet, instead, it has survived, as we heard from the Deputy Lord Mayor, for the past 850 years in the care of the Municipal Authority of Dublin. And Dubliners have preserved it because the people of Dublin considered it of fundamental importance, using the word fundamental in its literal sense. It is the thing which, on which Dublin's existence as an English city depended. And I suppose its significance, when you think about it, there's two general headings under which you might describe its significance. One is constitutional, I suppose you could put it, and the other obviously is commercial. I'm always struck by the nonchalance, and not to say the arrogance of Henry II when he talks about this place as my city of Dublin. I mean, he'd only set foot in it a wet day before that. My city of Dublin, but what is he saying really? He is saying that Dublin is now a royal city, and therefore, being a royal city, it's entitled to royal protection. And to be fair to Henry and to his successors, they did actually take this duty very seriously in the generations that followed. Now, as regards the commercial and other benefits that charter afforded, it's clear that its importance lies in the fact that if you were from Bristol and if you came to Dublin in or after the winter of 1172 and you lived here in Dublin as a freeman, then this charter meant that you could avail in Dublin of exactly the same laws you had at home, the same rights and privileges, the same customs and liberties. So you knew you were not going to be taking a major risk in coming here. And so they did begin to arrive into Dublin in very considerable numbers. I mean, if you look at that magnificent text that we heard about earlier from the Deputy Lord Mayor, the Dublin Guild Merchant Roll, you can see the names in it of many of these merchants from Bristol and its hinterland. It's a membership roll of the city's guild merchant. It's by far the most valuable source to come down to us from Dublin in the decades following its conquest. I mean, it's basically like a telephone directory. If you like, I used to love telephone directories when I was a kid, just flicking through them, looking at the names. It's a long list of names. It is virtually unique in Britain and Ireland. It is the names of nearly 8,500 men and 3 women. It's the first mention we've had of women in any of our discussions. And these are all individuals, not necessarily who lived in Dublin, but who were licensed to trade in Dublin. And it appeared from about 1190 to 1265. And over the years, I spent lots of time going through all 8,482 names, trying to figure out where people came from. Those people who moved to Dublin or who were trading in Dublin from this point onwards. And the majority of identifiable merchants come from within a radius of about 100 kilometres of Bristol. So the lands on both sides of the, let me see if I have a map of it. Lands on both sides of the Bristol Channel, the Severn Estuary, the valleys of the Severn and the Avon. In old county terms, you're talking about Gloucestershire, by far the largest in terms of representation. Gloucestershire is where more people hail from than any other English county, bleeding from there then into Wiltshire, down into Somerset and Devon. In Wales, Monmouthshire, Glamorgan and over towards Pembroke in the far west, and then up to Herefordshire and Worcestershire. This is where Dublin is getting its merchants from in the years after Henry issued his charter. But we've lots of other signs of Bristol presence in Dublin in these years. Dr. Grace O'Keefe is here, and she is the expert on this area, so I'm delighted to say she'll be talking. As soon as I shut up, she'll be able to tell us all about this. And we're honoured, as we heard earlier, also to have the presence with us today of the Lord Mayor of Bristol. And so I just want to finish with one story, if you don't mind. I mean, Bristol received a royal charter granting it the mayoralty, but even before they got that charter, they had a mayor anyway. And this mayor of Bristol in the late 12th century, early 13th century, was assisted by 2 provosts. And I think it's a remarkable fact that, you know, within a generation of the grant of the Dublin-Bristol Charter that we are remembering today, there was a mayor and 2 provosts of Bristol at the same time, who were actually among the most prominent citizens of Dublin at that time. And Grace will probably be talking about those very individuals soon. And historians of Bristol, when they look at those individuals, understandably they view them in the Bristol context. We Dublin historians look at them in the Irish context, and it's as if they're 2 different peoples, 2 different sets of individuals when they cross the Irish Sea, which they must constantly have been doing, living separate lives. And we have 2 separate histories of them, which is pretty bad, but Grace is sorting all that, making amends for that. And I said I have one other story for you. In terms of the long-term connection between Dublin and Bristol, they did die down after a time, but medieval Dubliners did maintain a very potent memory. I mean, it's a pity that we've lost it. A potent memory of their Bristol origins. The Dubliner Richard Stanihurst, of course, is one of the great figures of later medieval and early modern Dublin history, and in 1577 he wrote this account. You probably won't be able to read. I'll read through it for you. It's about an event it's about a great procession which took place in Dublin every year on Easter Monday. It was called the Black Monday Procession, and he explains the origins of it as to do with this massacre of the citizens back in 1209. Soon after Ireland was conquered by the Britons and the greater part of Leinster pacified, divers townsmen of Bristow, that's Bristol, flitted from thence to Dublin, and in short space the city was by them so well inhabited as it grew to be very populous. Whereupon the citizens, having overgreat affiance in the multitude of the people, and so consequently being somewhat wretchless in heeding the mountain enemy that lurked under their noses, were wont to roam and roll in clusters, sometime 3 or 4 miles from the town, the Irish enemy spying that the citizens were accustomed to fetch such odd vagaries, especially on the holidays, and having an inkling withal by some false clatterfert or other that a company of them would have ranged abroad on Monday in the Easter week towards the wood of Cullen. If you know Ranelagh, you'll know Cullen's Wood, so you'll know where this is. He says it's distant 2 miles from Dublin. And they laid in sundry places for their coming. The citizens flock unarmed out of the city to the wood, where being intercepted, they were to the number of 500 miserably slain, whereupon the remnant of the citizens, deeming that unlucky time to be a cross or a dismal day, gave it the appellation of Black Monday. And then he says, the city, soon after being peopled by a fresh supply of Bristolians, to dare the Irish enemy agreed to banquet yearly in that place, which to this day is observed. For the mayor and the sheriffs with the citizens repair to the Wood of Cullen, in which place the mayor bestoweth a costly dinner within a moat or a roundel, and both the sheriffs within another, where they are so well guarded by the youth of the city as the mountain enemy dareth not attempt to snatch as much as a pasty crust thence. So I'm hoping the Deputy Mayor will arrange such a feast for us later today. Now, I have no idea, to be honest, how much faith we can place in that account by Stanihurst, but given the Bristol origins of so many of the merchant class, it may just be relevant that in other accounts of the Black Monday procession, they emphasize the fact that it was led by the city guilds. And guilds, of course, are monopolies or cartels, a kind of exclusive club. So they exist in part to add cohesion to the members, but in part to keep outsiders on the outside. Now, the Dublin Guild merchant role, which I mentioned to you earlier, derives from the foundation of the Guild of Merchants in the city, and that originated as a Bristol thing. It's interesting, this is another famous Dublin charter issued in 1192 by the Lord John, the future King John. It's a grant of liberties to Dublin. It's based exactly on one that he gave to Bristol just 2 or 3 years earlier, and it specifically states that Dublin is to have the same guilds as Bristol has. So if you consider then for a second, this document again that I was talking about, the guild merchant role, this unique membership role of the guild. It suggests a class of merchants who are ring fencing their existence and their operations. You're either one of us or you're not, and you must be a paid up member to participate. And so it's interesting to think again about Stanihurst's account. He specifies that it is the Bristolian citizens of Dublin who set out to Cullen's Wood on Easter Monday in 1209, and it was a new influx of Bristolians who keep a memory of that alive in their annual procession, literally for centuries thereafter. And I suppose Black Monday was about reinforcing the identity of Dubliners, how they must stick together because everywhere they're surrounded by enemies. And it's reinforcing it through commemoration of this specific incident, though. The Dubliners are choosing to remember something else also, which is their Bristolian heritage. And that, I suppose, is what we are doing today. And I'll leave it there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Seán. That was such a fascinating paper to get us started. I love Richard Stanihurst, and especially that strange way that he writes all the words he tries to make up. Anyway, fascinating stuff. We're going to move on to our second paper in this first panel today. Our speaker is Dr. Grace O'Keefe, who received her PhD from Trinity College Dublin in 2012. Her PhD was on the subject of the Hospital of St. John the Baptist without the Newgate of Dublin, which is just really up the hill, a little way, 2 minutes walk in that direction. She is now the online editor for History Ireland, and during her PhD and since, she's worked with the Dublin City Council on a range of really wonderful heritage and research projects. She was the co-founder of the Tales of Medieval Dublin series, which is a long-running collaboration between the Friends of Medieval Dublin and Dublin City Council. She very recently did some wonderful research into St. Nicholas's Church in Artane, creating new sort of heritage materials locally there. And she's working now with the Dublin City Council on the Wood Quay Oral History Project, which collects the stories of those who worked on the excavation of the remarkable Hiberno North site that used to lay underneath us and sort of all around us here in this venue. Today she's going to speak to us about a topic that she's published on in the Medieval Dublin series, and it arises from the really wonderfully detailed and forensic work of her PhD on the early inhabitants of Dublin once it came under English control. The title of her paper is The Bristolian Residents of Medieval Dublin. Grace.
Apologies to Sparky, I actually changed the title of my paper. So now it's called Mayor, a Mill and Medieval Migration. Thanks very much to Caoimhe for setting me up. Thanks to Sparky for that introduction. I don't know if I'm going to live up to that introduction, but I'll try my best. Deputy Lord Mayor of Dublin, Councillor Joe Costello, Lord Mayor of Bristol, Steve Smith, and all of those joining us in person and online, you're very welcome today. Many thanks to Seán for the invitation to talk today, for the Friends of Medieval Dublin and Dublin City Council, for the opportunity to have this wonderful in-person and online talk today. I want to just, while I think of it, reiterate something that Councillor Costello said, and that's about Dr. Mary Clark, archivist, Dublin City archivist, and actually all archivists, because I think for anyone working in any research over the last few years, with not having in-person access to archives, the work of archivists in making those available to researchers has been absolutely phenomenal. So I think it's a good opportunity to acknowledge. I've only kind of dealt with Dr. Clark once, and it was actually to get an image of the charter that we're talking about today for a talk a few years ago, and she couldn't have been more helpful. So I just wanted to mention that. I've spoken about my Bristolians, as I tend to think of them, a handful of times. One of them was in this particular venue. The talk that I gave here was one of a series in, as Sparky just mentioned, the first Tales of Medieval Dublin, which is a lecture series that myself and Sparky devised as postgraduates. Now, I should mention that Seán was our PhD supervisor at the time, and he may have given us a little bit of help. From the very beginning, when we talked about this lecture series, one of the most important criteria was that it was to be about the people who lived in the city, the people who walked its streets, and not in as much as was possible about the knights and the kings who saw the city as a resource. We wanted it to be about the people who saw Dublin as a home. We wanted to bring to life the names in the deeds, the people who owned buildings, the neighbours engaged in disputes, the women listing their household objects in wills. It was the men and women who leaned against this wall here behind us, gossiping, plotting, making acquaintances, buying and selling, that were of interest to us then. And it is these men and women that I'm going to talk about today. Much of the discussion today will be about politics and law and the meaning of words, the intentions of kings. But for my time with you, I'm going to take you into the lives of some of those who were impacted by these words and intentions. I'm hoping very much that particularly Professor Vincent's analysis of the Charter is not going to completely negate everything that I'm about to say. So first, to let you know how my talk is laid out, and first I'm going to cover kind of how I came across the two families that I'm going to introduce you to today. A little bit about how I think these Bristolians adapted to life in their new city. And then I'm going to give you a brief overview of the family trees of these two particular families. Now, the network that I'm sharing with you today is a very, very small section of what I've kind of put together, and time pressures really just don't allow for a full exposition of them today. I know that there's an even greater network out there beyond those that I was in a position to research. And I'd just like to say, if there's anyone here that has any money that would like to pay me to do that research, I'll be here during the break. Feel free to come and talk to me. Now, my first introduction to this group was through the research I did, as Sparky mentioned, for my PhD on the Hospital of St. John the Baptist, which is just up the road from us here. It's now where the Church of St. Augustine and St. John is. So that whole complex, and there's all apartments and everything behind it there. So that whole complex was, from the late 12th to the mid-16th century, a hospital for the poor and sick, and that was the subject of my PhD. So we see on Speed here, so that's for anyone who's not familiar with Speed, this is the 1610 map of Dublin by John Speed. And if you see up here, number 54, this is Thomas Street here, and number 54 was where the hospital was. So to give you a sense of placement, down here, number 12, is it? 12 is the college, so that's Trinity, which you can see in 1610, you know, was still really out in the burbs, like it was outside the city proper. The hospital itself was founded in the 1180s. It was a very typical institution for its time. It emerged in Dublin at a time of immense social change and urbanisation. Now, among some of those characteristics of an urbanised environment that one expects to find, and I quote Harold Clark, you expect to find non-agrarian economic specialisation, a street network, defensive works in the shape of ditches, walls, mural, towers and gate, town privileges. However, if Henry II expected his men of Bristol to trade with and inhabit Dublin, their needs had to be anticipated and provided for. Now, some of these needs were religious, others were defensive, while others were simply intended to enhance the quality of life of those settling in the city. By 1200, 5 royal charters had been issued to Dublin. Now, administrative changes are an easy way in which to identify a city's expansion. Another is the way in which it physically changed, the way new buildings, walls, mural towers were built. James Lydon has argued for the recognition of the continuity between existing institutions in Dublin and new arrivals. And certainly it's true that a city which had been minting its own coins for around 200 years had clearly already begun to organise itself in a municipal manner. But there were differences which emerged in the early years of the English presence. And one of those differences, which I believe was actively encouraged by Henry's Charter, was the increased number of merchants, adventurers and royal officials travelling to or settling in Dublin. Now, this cosmopolitan mix in Dublin, the increased population, both transient and permanent, while a great boon to its urban development, also created much greater pressures on the facilities that the city had to offer. Now, in addition to purely religious foundations, like St. Thomas's Abbey, this is a still taken from a fantastic little video done by production company NoHo and given to me with the permission of Dublinia, and it's available to see if you haven't been in Dublinia for a while. Again, it's just across the road from us here. So this is a view of St. Thomas's Abbey in its heyday. So we've new religious foundations. We also have defensive administrative foundations like Dublin Castle. A need emerged for a place that could cater for all of those for whom the city represented not so much a new financial opportunity, but a place where shelter, food, and the ability to support yourself had become, however temporarily, impossible to provide. So this is where, say, my hospital stepped in. But if it was created by Dublin's newest residents, it also had to be supported by Dublin's newest residents. Now, the support of St. John's and Dublin's many other religious institutions then was one possible way in which the English of Ireland, these new English of Ireland, and in particular the Bristolians, could foster a sense of community amongst themselves. It provided something for which statutes and charters might not have been able to legislate. And by patronising these houses, those same citizens were buying their way into a part of the new identity in Dublin. Excuse me, just one second. Now, as an aside, I refer to them as being merchants, and I refer to them as merchants. I'm not going to discuss what the individuals that I'm going to talk about traded, mostly because I don't know. I don't know what they traded. We do know what was traded in general over and back across the Irish Sea. And of course, it's well known that even before 1169, a lot of pottery made its way from Bristol and the wider Gloucestershire region to Dublin. So this one, the Ham Green, takes its name from the kilns that operated in an area near Bristol. This is kind of a gratuitous slide. I don't really need to show you Ham Green pottery, but I think it's a great image. It's the cover. It actually forms the cover of that particular medieval Dublin volume. But I suppose one of the things I like about being able to show objects again is just to reiterate that we're talking about people, and that we're talking about people who, cooked things and carried things and sometimes had functional pottery. Am I too loud?
Oh, no, you keep
okay. Had functional pottery and also had kind of nice, fancy, strange things. So that's kind of why I included that slide. Now, a little bit of house rules about how I've approached the identification of individuals and their relationships. One of the first tasks I did when I began my PhD was to build a database of all the names and places mentioned in the deeds that I was using, which meant that I could cross-reference all of these people and places together. Now, most of these people were landowners themselves, and they regularly appeared as witnesses in each other's charters. Now, the use of witness lists sometimes kind of has detractors about how reliable it is, were the witnesses actually there, were the witnesses added on at the end. The Scottish historian David Brun undertook a comprehensive paleographic examination of charters and their witness lists, and on the whole has concluded that the witnesses were present, and were present. Part of the reason maybe is because they actually wanted their names included for posterity, and it kind of looked good for them. David Brun was my external examiner for my PhD, so I'm going to go with him. I'm going to stick with David's approach. So the approach that I've taken is to accept the witnesses as being present in the charters that I have used. So therefore, where many of the same names appear on witness lists of each other's charters, I go to take this as example or as evidence for a particular social grouping. Now, in addition to being part of a group of citizens in the city who were migrants and settlers, we see from the many deeds in which they are mentioned that these men and women were, and their extended families were neighbours in Dublin as well. The area outside the western gate, did I put speed back? Yeah. So over, basically along here, so this is all outside, number 50 there is where the western gate is. So all of this out here is, oh, thank you, is Francis Street. Oh yeah, here, that's perfect, sorry. So all of this out here is kind of the western suburb of the city, basically. So it seems to have been a neighbourhood of kind of high density settlement, largely undeveloped prior to the English conquest of Dublin, and it certainly would seem that a lot of the Bristolians that I have been looking at had land there and had settled out in that part of the city. Okay. So let's get on to some names. So today I'm going to talk to you about Haim of Bristol. His brothers Roger and Adhelm, and also then the brothers William and Roger Cordwainer. So the first of our family trees. I had a lot more that I could put into the family trees, but there's only so much you can look at, there's only so much time that we have today. The first reference to the Haim brothers that I came across was in a confirmation given to the Hospital of St. John's in 1188 by Pope Clement III. And essentially in this he confirmed the kind of the possessions and the rule of the hospital. Now, from this particular confirmation, we know that Roger, so we start with Roger up the top here, we know that Roger had a residence in the western suburb. So like I said, out by kind of Thomas Street area, he had a residence out there. A couple of years later, Roger, this time with his wife Margaret, So this is how I kind of added all these people up. Every time a name is mentioned, it gets thrown into the family tree. Family tree gets added to the list. So a couple of years later, Roger, this time with his wife Margaret, donated a rent of 12 shillings, which was to be paid at Michaelmas and Easter, from other land which was in the same street as the hospital. So now we know he's at least a double property owner. In this witness list, another brother called Adhelm was listed. Now, Haim, his brothers, and their own extended families would appear to have been part of Dublin city life from its earliest days as an English royal possession. Adhelm is the earliest English settler in Dublin recorded in an official capacity. I hope I'm not going to be proved wrong by saying that by our following speakers. During Henry II's sojourn in Dublin in 1171-2, and in a charter which was witnessed by, amongst others, Hugh de Lacy, the king granted Adhelm, who was noted also as being the brother of Hammond of Bristol, land outside the eastern gate of Dublin. So where did I put this here? I'm going to come back to this slide because there was a lot of kind of movement around this area. Again, this image is with the kind permission of NoHo. But out here, so there was land granted out here. Now, if you think about it, these are the defensive walls of the town. This is Dublin Castle here. You're coming out and then down what we would now know as Dame Street, or the Street of the Dams. So this is pretty, you're not going to give land outside the walls, like land at an entrance into the city to someone that you don't trust. So I think it's a fair assumption that Adhelm was somebody who was seen by Henry as trustworthy. This same land was later then granted by Adhelm's daughter. If we go back, can I go back? Yeah. Was granted by Adhelm's daughter Alicia with the consent of her husband Stephen to the Cistercians of St. Mary's in Oxman Town. In the early 13th century, Alicia granted a Germanus Doubleday her lands outside the gate of St. Mary del Dam, between the city wall and a mill, land which had been held from her father by William Doubleday, Germanus's uncle. The mill, in addition to its water, situated between the gate of St. Mary del Dam and St. Andrew's Church. If I go on again. So we're looking at between the church here. So we're probably talking about, I think, maybe one of these mills along here. And that the land then is somewhere, it's maybe this parcel of land here. Incidentally, if you're familiar with Harold Clark's map here, the two mills are noted as Doubleday's mills on this particular map. So the mill, in addition to its water, situated between the gate of St. Mary del Dam and St. Andrew's Church, had been granted to William Doubleday by John, who in that particular charter was noted as the son of the king. So it was probably when he was Lord of Ireland. He's not called Count of Mortmain in it, so it's probably before 1189. So it's a fairly early charter. William later granted half of this mill and his body, presumably for burial, with half his house beside St. Olaf's Church, which would have been up the hill from us here, to the monks of St. Mary's Abbey. In the early 1230s, Adhelm's granddaughter Scholastica, if we go back to, so we're at Adhelm down here, she, Scholastica, along with her husband, further gave St. Mary's all rights and claims which had been Adhelm's outside the eastern gate. The three brothers, Adhelm, Haim and Roger, also seem to have been very prominent landowners along Dublin's riverine walls, which again I think is a place where you're trying to protect and you're trying to protect kind of breaches of the wall along there. It's speculation, but I've wondered, because they were so, certainly Adhelm being so early mentioned in a charter by Henry II in Dublin. I've wondered, is it possible that they could have been part of maybe a party who petitioned Henry for a charter like that, who accompanied him over, and maybe were working behind the scenes to try and suggest that something like this would have been granted. It's possible. Now, Roger and Aldhelm are usually referred to by their fraternal link to Haim in the middle here, but he's actually been really, really difficult to identify. In the Guild Merchant Roll, which Seán mentioned, there's also a Robert, brother of Haim, being listed. Now, I haven't put him in here. That's the only reference I have. I don't know if he's the same one. These guys, I know they're all family. But there's this Robert, brother of Haim, also listed in the Guild Merchant Roll. From where he is, his membership of the Guild probably dates to around the late 12th century. So again, tying in with kind of the date of activity of these guys. Now, based on the evidence of religious cartularies, Roger and his family were clearly very actively involved in the life of medieval Dublin. The Abbey of St. Mary was, more than any other institution, their chosen destination for benefaction. This continued into the next generation with donations and confirmations of their parents' grants by Stephen, Roger's son, and Alicia, Aldhelm's daughter in particular. Now, in a charter of Stephen's to St. Mary's, so Stephen up at the top there with Roger, in a charter of Stephen to St. Mary's, his brother John is listed as a monk. So this may explain the strong link then between the family and St. Mary's, if one of their own was a monk in the abbey. Roger was also, excuse me, one second. Roger was also amongst the benefactors to Holy Trinity, as his grant of land in Crocker Street. So Crocker Street would have been up, where are we here, orientate, up along kind of parallel with Thomas Street. So it would have been down kind of sort of parallel with the Liffey and parallel between Thomas Street and the Liffey. Think of it of that way. So other extended family then can be traced through Roger's wife, Margaret. In a charter of Margaret's in which she gave a part of her land opposite the Church of St. Nicholas in Dublin to Adam Palmer, the witnesses are listed as a Richard Gillamichael, which is called Genere Meo, and Simon also referred to as Genere Meo. So if that's relative, my family, my kin. Now, in a 1234 inspeximus of earlier charters of another Margaret, daughter of Richard Gillamichael, we get details of several rents and plots held by her in Dublin, but also land held of her in Bristol, and half a mark due from this land in Bristol, due by a Richard Cordwainer. I'll be talking about the Cordwainers next. Now, this particular charter gives us a really impressive insight into the amount of land held by Richard's daughter, Margaret. So we're looking at Richard Gillamichael, who's somehow related to Margaret, who's Roger's wife. So this Margaret had a really, really impressive property portfolio. She had land in Cornmarket, up by St. Audens down the road. She'd land in Bertram's Court, which would have been just across the road. She'd more down by St. Patrick's Cathedral and more in Oxmantown, in addition to this land that she had in Bristol. Now, Margaret's grant was made to the nuns of St. Mary de Hoggs, down by down by Trinity, for her soul and that of Alexander, the anchorite of St. Clement's. By the late 1230s, this same Alexander made a grant to All Hallows Priory, the site of which would then later become Trinity's, for the salvation of many souls, including those of his sister Margaret. Now, where does somebody with the name Gillamichael or Gillamy-Hall come into a Bristolian family? It would appear that he seems to have a fairly mixed ethnic background. Now, there's loads. I mean, these guys had a huge property portfolio, and I'd have had to have like a spider chart of all sorts of things going across. So this is just a tiny little excerpt of the amount of land that they had. Now, the charter given to Adhelm by Henry II, which I've mentioned, does suggest that he and perhaps his two brothers were very trusted Bristolians. Given their high status in Dublin, one would expect that they would be prominent landowners and burgesses in Bristol, but they don't seem to have left the same impact on Bristol's records as they have in Dublin. Despite their relative importance in the early stages of the English settlement of Dublin and the trust that Henry II must have had in them to grant, well, certainly Adhelm, to grant him land beside one of the entrances in the city, the records from medieval Bristol are overwhelmingly silent on Adhelm, Haim and Roger. There are some pipe roll references to Roger, but considering their importance here and considering that they're always referred to by their connection to Bristol, I find it really strange that they weren't more prominent in Bristol. But now, the Cordwainers. Okay, in 1194, the two brothers, so I'm mostly looking at Roger and William. So in 1194, these two brothers, William and Roger, were noted in the pipe roll for the honour of Gloucestershire regarding several payments. But in the same decade, they were both attestors, they were witnesses to a grant by Nicholas de Castello to the Hospital of St. John's in Dublin. And it is from a grant made by this Nicholas to the monks of St. Mary's Abbey that we learn kind of Roger's Cordwainer's donation to the hospital. Nicholas described his donation as land which is between the land I gave to the Hospital of St. John and the land which Roger Cordwainer gave the same hospital, namely opposite the Church of St. James to the south. William and Roger together made a grant to St. Mary's in Dublin. In early 1200, letters of protection were issued for the two brothers, while in 1206, Roger was acquitted for 300 marks paid to King John on behalf of the justiciar. And this refers to him as a Roger Cordwainer of Bristol. Roger again was one on a lengthy list of witnesses to a grant made by Baldwin, son of Gill. And in this list also are Adhelm and Roger, brothers of Haim. Roger, brother of Haim, it gets confused with all the Rogers, I know. Roger, brother of Haim and Baldwin would appear to have had links which predated their patronage of St. John's in Dublin. As in 1179, 1180, a Roger, brother of Haim, Daniel and Baldwin, son of Gill, are noted together in the pipe roll for Gloucestershire as owing 2 marks for the chattels of a Gillamichael. Now, is this the same Richard Gillamichael, who seems to be the relative of Roger's wife? I don't know. Those, all those connections can only be speculative. But I mention all of them. I know it's a little bit hard to keep track of all the Rogers. But the reason I mention it is because you see these little connections and you can only speculate, are these exactly all the same people? But what I find interesting about it is that you see them popping up in English records involved in business in England at exactly the same time, that they're also involved in business in Dublin. So I think it reiterates that they are active on both sides of the Irish Sea. I think that's, for me, that's the thing, to take from it. There's an awful lot of detail. There's so much more than I've even put into this. But I think that's kind of the thing to take away from it, is that their businesses are continuing on both sides of the Irish Sea, and they have interests in Bristol that are still very active while they still have interest in Dublin. Where was I? Sorry. Yeah. So this particular entry, so this one of Roger, brother of Haim, and the Baldwin, son of Gill, this continues, this goes through the pipe rolls up until kind of the late 1186, 1187. Now, the most compelling evidence for the continued importance of the Cordwainers, and Roger in particular, to life in Bristol into the 13th century is his position as mayor of Bristol, which I found first in a grant that was made to St. Thomas's. Now, this is supported by a reference in the close rolls in 1216 to Roger Cordwainer, again named as Mayor of Bristol. The entries further demonstrate that actually an important function of Bristol's medieval mayor was the care of the royal wine stores. As we can see, instruction to Roger as Mayor of Bristol was to deliver 15 dolia, which is like a jar, kind of a jar or a vessel. He was to deliver 15 of these of wine to the Earl of Chester, 2 to John of Monmouth, and 2 to a Colin de Rutop, maybe. So while Roger was clearly referred to as the mayor, it's unclear if he was endowed with full mayoral privileges or how he was elected. There is no extant record of Bristol receiving the right to a mayor, such as was given to Dublin by King Henry III in 1229, nor is there any evidence for this early date of the citizens of Bristol being granted the right to select their mayor. But here we have this guy in Dublin being called the Mayor of Bristol. Now, given John's difficulties in the latter years of his reign, it could simply be that he instituted a man who had proven himself as a loyal subject over many years, so that he kind of instituted him into an informal mayoralty. Bristol had shown itself loyal to John's family, and John, through his marriage to Isabella of Gloucestershire, had even more reason to secure the continued loyalty of the important port of Bristol. In a later charter of 1236, Roger is mentioned as having been mayor during John's reign. And interestingly, it also states that William, his brother, had been a provost in Bristol at the same time. So the two of them are very, very active in Bristol, while at the same time we're finding continually that they're witnessing charters over in Dublin for land and property in Dublin. Now, that a formal charter had not been given prior to Roger being termed mayor does not mean that he was not accepted as mayor. There is, a mayor could often be set up without formal permission. It was a sort of like a self-assertion of a town. In a record of Bristol's history, written between the late 15th and early 16th centuries by a town clerk, Robert Rickard, the first mayor is listed for 1217 and is called Adam Page. Rickard does note, however, that there has, as he terms it, there has always been a mayor in this town since the conquest. Now, it's possible that the truth lies somewhere in the middle of all of this. So, Rickard represents the year given up to the 14th of September, and Adam Page was listed by Rickard as being the mayor in 1217. So I would kind of propose that it's possible that he was the successor to Roger Cordwainer in Michaelmas 1216 and was then mayor up until 1217. Henry III had a council in November 1216 in Bristol. And it's possible that there was some kind of formal recognition then during the reissuing of Magna Carta in this council, that there would be kind of an official mayor, and then that this Adam Page is the first official mayor under that system. In 2016, Bristol celebrated the 800th anniversary of its first mayor. And in an article published that year in the Transaction of the Bristol and Gloucestershire Archaeological Society, John Goodwin reiterated something that I had published in Medieval Dublin, saying that Roger was clearly the mayor in Bristol, but the official list begins in 2016, and it's a century before the city actually got its mandate, its official mandate to allow Bristol to elect a mayor. He makes a good concluding point on it, which I'm going to quote here. He says, "It is clear that the Crown was willing to accept the chief officer of the town, often referred to locally as the mayor, as a person with whom a king or his royal officials could deal with on behalf of the town. Yet," he says, "this does not imply a formal recognition of a legal right for the town to be represented by such an official." So clearly, Roger had had proven his ability, had proven his loyalty to the crown, had proven his abilities in Bristol, and was accepted as a mayor as such, despite the fact that this actual right to elect a mayor didn't really actually come for another 100 years. Now, so we've the two Cordwainer brothers, really important in Bristol, very active in Dublin. What about their wider family? Despite Roger's position as mayor of Bristol, it seems that his children actually were more prominent as Dubliners than they were as Bristolians. Roger's descendants are well represented as a result of their possession of a piece of land in Ballymadden in North County Dublin, over which there was a huge amount of legal cases, basically concerning the right of who was the correct descendant. And it was from these legal cases that I got a lot of the names of the children, the grandchildren, and also kind of the next generation of people that they married. I could have packed this out with information, but you know, there's only so much you can take in one go. So we know that Roger, now as part of this dispute in Ballymadden, it says that his wife, who is unnamed, the manor of Ballymadden was her dower. The ownership of it then, it seems to pass through John, who married an Africa here. She later, on his death, seems to have married a Roger Owen, who I think might be the same Roger Owen who was mayor. Oh, my time, sorry, I'm nearly done. Who was possibly mayor in the 1230s and 1240s. Again, showing, you know, if you're at a certain level in society, you're intermarrying, you're marrying the same kind of status within society. Okay, I'll skip that bit. Okay, right, so to wrap up, the families that I shared with you today, these family trees, they're like, I mean, they're really only a fraction of what existed in Dublin, and even just what's here does in no way fully convey the extent of kind of property holdings and involvement in Dublin and Bristol that these two families had. While the connections between the two medieval cities, of course, has been long known, what I hope my modest contribution to the discussion is that it fulfills kind of what I said I do at the start of my talk, which is to show a little bit of the human impact of the settlement, the actual people, the names of the people who came, and you know, their descendants then who became really entrenched in Dublin life and became, you know, Dubliners themselves. When I first came across the reference to Roger Cordwainer as mayor of Bristol, being in Dublin and being so important in Dublin, I was really excited by it. Leaving aside the argument that none of these men actually had any business being in Ireland, the presence of the mayor, and even more so what I think is the deeper involvement of their children and grandchildren in life in Dublin, I think it's a really strong indicator of the continued importance of Dublin to Bristol. Dublin wasn't a get-rich-quick scheme for Bristolians that lasted, you know, the 1180s and 1190s and then kind of fell off the cliff, where landlords and landowners were absentee, which we see in later centuries in Ireland. These people were very much here, very much involved in life in Dublin. Something that struck me when Seán was talking about the kind of the numbers of people here, and it is possibly because of this charter that it took the risk, you know, Henry II's charter took the risk of resettlement away for them, and it made it so much easier for them to come over. My last bit sparky, I promise. So the title of my talk today was A Mayor, a Mill and Medieval Migration. Apart from being a fan of alliterative titles, all of these elements comprise my experience of the relations between medieval Dublin and Bristol. And I hope I've conveyed some of that vibrant medieval community to you today. Thank you very much. I'm so sorry.
Thank you very much, Grace. I loved that kind of personal window, I suppose, onto the people actually who took up that call that's represented, I suppose, in that grant. You know, the people that actually lie behind this like quite brief legal document. And I love seeing how many women you were able to trace in that as well, just from in terms of my own interests. We are just going to have our questions in the more informal setting of the tea break. So if Seán and Grace haven't been too exhausted by delivering their papers, they might chat with you if you have any queries over tea and coffee, which is just through the doors, which are now open at the back of the room. So let's just quickly thank them again and then reconvene around the coffee.
Thank you. My name's Peter Crooks, also from Trinity College Dublin. You're very welcome. I was once upon a time a friend of medieval Dublin, in the sense of the formal organisation. I think I'm still a friend in spirit, and I'm grateful to the friends for allowing me to participate today and introduce this second session in A Tale of Two Cities, where we see in this session a shift in focus, I suppose, from our earlier papers, which were looking at the citizens and the cities and the grantees and so on, to the charter itself. And really, in terms of who you could ask to speak on this topic, we are incredibly privileged this afternoon to have the two people in the world who could speak with the most authority on Henry II and Ireland and this charter. I'll introduce them in turn, and at the end of the session we will have a chance to have some questions from the earlier paper as well, and so we'll try and wrap that up before we finish this evening. This first session we begin with my friend Mary-Therese Flanagan. Professor Flanagan is from Queen's University Belfast, author of many books and articles and editions on 12th century Ireland, but a book that was seminal for all of us who were studying, when I began studying now 25 years ago, was her 1989 study, Irish Society, Anglo-Norman Settlers and Angevin Kingship. And that three-part title really describes the contribution Mary-Therese has made to scholarship, the way she has moved from Irish society and brought in the Angevin world and the Anglo-Normans so seamlessly in her scholarship. And she's somebody who can really sum up with enormous authority the seminal shift that we are tracing today in relations between the two islands, as exemplified by this particular document, the Charter to Dublin. So I'll hand straight to Mary-Therese with my thanks.
Thank you very much. I should add also that I am a Dubliner. So we've already heard from Seán that in 1171 Henry II mounted an expedition to Ireland, during which he issued the charter that we're discussing today. And as Seán said, the expedition lasted for 6 months. So what I want to do is ask the questions: what brought the King of England to Ireland? What determined the timing of his arrival in Ireland in late 1171? What determined the timing of his departure in April 1172? And what did he achieve whilst he was in Ireland? Now, Seán mentioned, and I shall only briefly refer to it, the fact that Henry II had expressed an interest in a conquest of Ireland in 1155. And I don't propose to go into that except to say that there is a range of independent evidence to show that he did briefly contemplate a conquest of Ireland, and that such a conquest was discussed at a royal council at Winchester in 1155, and that following on from that council, a request to the Pope for approval was made, which resulted in the issue of a papal privilege or bull by Pope Adrian IV, who's notable, as Seán said, for the fact that he's the only Englishman to have been elected a pope. I suppose I could politely add thus far. It remains to be seen whether there's a possibility of such a future event. But that papal bull issued by Pope Adrian IV in response to the request, known as Laudabiliter from the first name of the text, as it is now extant. That text is a concocted forgery, but Adrian is likely to have issued some form of document in reply to Henry's petition to the Pope for endorsement of his proposal to launch a conquest of Ireland. Henry's plan, briefly entertained in 1155, was quickly abandoned, and indeed it was hardly practicable at that particular time, given that a bitter civil war had racked England for almost 2 decades prior to Henry's accession as king in 1154. And given also that raising the financial resources for an Irish campaign might have proved difficult at that time, since Henry was already heavily burdened with debt from the campaigns that he'd had to fight to secure possession of the English throne. So the context for Henry's eventual arrival in Ireland in 1171 is actually to be sought in Ireland. And the sequence of events is well known. In the autumn of 1166, Irish affairs were brought to the court of Henry II by the exiled King of Leinster, Dermot MacMurrough, seeking military aid from Henry to help him recover his kingdom, from which he had been expelled by the High King, Rory O'Connor, King of Connacht. Now, Henry did not himself, as Dermot might perhaps have hoped, respond to Dermot's request to go to Ireland himself. He didn't respond that he would himself go at that time, but he did give permission for the recruitment of fighters by Dermot from among Henry's subjects. And it was to be another 4 years before Henry himself decided to go himself to Ireland. So what determined the timing of Henry's arrival in October 1171? It's a pertinent question, given that organising military campaigns in autumn was not a usual practice. Henry was taking a risk in undertaking a campaign over the winter months, and furthermore, a seaborne expedition that would make travel across the Irish Sea susceptible to hazardous weather conditions that might cut off supply chains for the army. As one contemporary English chronicler, Ralph of Diss, recorded, hold on, I didn't get that to work. Yeah, there we've got him now. He recorded that for a stretch of 20 weeks following the King's arrival in Ireland, no word of news reached him from his own kingdom, nor could it do so because the wind was contrary. Now, Seán has already mentioned that the winter of 1171 was very difficult. The prevailing winds basically prevented seaborne travel between Ireland and England and made it too dangerous. And the vital importance of the prevailing winds is evidenced, for example, by the fact that when Henry wished to leave Ireland in March 1172, he was obliged to wait for 2 weeks at Wexford because the winds made it too perilous for him to travel. Indeed, Henry had already faced difficulties when going to Ireland and was weather-bound for 18 days at Pembroke before he could embark for Ireland on the 17th of October 1171. The weather was so poor that autumn that the Welsh Chronicle, the British Trosoghion, claimed that the corn hardly ripened at all in Wales that year, which must have had implications for food shortages, notably bread. The first entry in the Munster Annals of Inishfallen for 1172 recorded very bad weather this year, which killed the greater part of the cattle of Ireland. A number of chroniclers recorded that there was horrendous thunder on Christmas Day throughout England, but especially in Ireland. And those contemporary observations are borne out by recent findings of climatic science that has highlighted a climate anomaly in the second half of the 12th century with a dominant Atlantic airstream, especially in the winter, creating a very windy period characterised by frequent Atlantic storms. And in light of recent storms, it doesn't take too much imagination, indeed, to envisage the impact in the 12th century, and that's without Met Éireann, to give you a heads up. Now, there's a very lengthy article in the Proceedings of the Royal Irish Academy for 2020 by Bruce Campbell and Ludlow, which is over 100 pages long, and it gives you the details for the weather conditions. Henry's expedition was to encounter other challenges besides the weather and maintaining lines of communication and supply. English and Welsh commentators noted that soldiers in his army took ill because of the unaccustomed meat they had to eat and the water they had to drink, and because of a lack of bread. There's interesting corroborative detail for that from near contemporary collections of miracle stories that recounted how individuals who had accompanied Henry to Ireland contracted various diseases and subsequently undertook pilgrimages to seek a cure for their ailments. Now here you have, these are two different sources, one from Wales, one from England, both of which recount how the unfamiliar consumption of fresh meat and water afflicted many of the King's army in Ireland who were suffering from a lack of bread and had diarrhea. And also, of course, the top one tells you there that the supply chain was severely impacted by the weather. So if we turn to the miracle collections, we have one here. There's a number in the relating to Canterbury relating to individuals who were in the King's Army in Ireland with him. So, for example, a knight named Henry de Pomeroy, in other words, a high-status individual, and indeed he's known from other sources as a landholder in Devon, he became afflicted with a swelling disease while serving in Henry's army in Ireland that greatly disfigured him. But on invoking the recently martyred Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, who had been assassinated on the 29th of December 1170, and on undertaking a pilgrimage to Canterbury, Henry de Pomeroy was cured and his appearance returned to normal. That anecdote is included in a collection of miracles compiled at Canterbury between 1172 and 1179. So in other words, it's a near contemporary source. It's very close to the time of Henry's expedition. Another soldier of Henry's army was cured of dysentery, which is interesting in light of Ralph of Dis's comment there about diarrhoea. Following his pilgrimage to Canterbury, yet another had an old wound reactivated in the Irish campaign because of the change of air and the unfamiliar food, it says. A similar anecdote in relation to adverse health impacts is recorded in another. Let me just see now if I can get this. Yes, another miracle collection relating to the shrine of the Virgin Mary at Rocamadour in Quercy in southern France. And what's noteworthy about this collection of miracles is, again, note the dates of compilation, 1172 to 1173, so very closely contemporaneous with Henry's Irish expedition. Now, the miracle, both of the miracle collections, the one from Canterbury and indeed the one from Rocamadour, were compiled as basically advertisement for these pilgrimage sites, basically hoping to drum up pilgrimage business. So the miracle collection of Our Lady of Rocamadour has the following account of two members of Henry's household who during the Irish campaign lost the ability to speak. And in their case too, it's the inclement air, the change of diet, and the fact that they had to drink water from rivers, which caused them to get ill. Now, what's interesting about this chap, Hugh de Gundeville, is that if you look at the charter over there, and maybe I have a, here he is there as a witness, Hugonet de Gundeville. So this is the chap who had to go on pilgrimage subsequently to Rocamadour to get cured. Now, Hugh de Gundeville is well known as an associate of Henry II, dating back to even before Henry's accession as king, and he was a frequent witness to the king's charters. Professor Vincent has suggested that he ought to be remembered as the first English visitor known to have been rendered incapable by Irish drink. It's river water, and at any rate, he's the first. Well, I suppose they do use it for the manufacture of Guinness, but in any case, he's the first named visitor to have succumbed to Irish drink. But he was close to Henry II, so close indeed. I haven't lost no, it's still here. So close that before Henry left Ireland, he entrusted the city of Waterford to Hugh de Gundeville. Hugh, however, cannot have remained very long in Ireland, since his pilgrimage to Rocamadour must have occurred no later than the autumn of 1173. And Hugh's early departure from Ireland indicates the tenuous nature of the administrative arrangements that Henry made, that he put in place prior to his departure in April 1172. As I say, these miracle collections functioned as up-to-date advertising campaigns for the promotion of these shrines, and the aim was to demonstrate the widest possible reach of the fame of the particular saint. We put in sort of, verification factors that folklorists would say, where you name individual places and persons. Well, from those miracle stories, it's evident that Henry's campaign in Ireland was not viewed by contemporaries as an unqualified success. Not that Henry hadn't undertaken careful preparations nor expended substantial resources on his expedition. According to a contemporary English chronicler, Roger of Howden in Yorkshire, who actually accompanied the king to Ireland, and that's critical really, the expedition comprised a fleet of 400 ships laden with military men, horses and arms and provisions. And historians have been able to calculate, at least in part, the costs of the transport, equipment and provisions. And as Seán has already mentioned, Professor Howard Clark undertook work to show where the provisions and supplies were focused on Bristol. They were collected together at Bristol. Now, we can work out that expenditure on transports, ships and food amounted to more than £2,852. Now, that's only an exchequer figure. That's we don't have the full picture of how much was spent. Much more must have been spent than that. But this sum is made up of sums that were paid out directly by the Exchequer in reimbursement to individual sheriffs who presented receipts for their expenditure at the Exchequer. So you can see here, I got my husband, to be frank, to do the very laborious and tedious work of counting up the percentages. And you can see that 47% of the total of the 2,852, which, as I say, was not, does not take account of payments made by the King's household or the Chamber. But of that figure, 47% was spent on foodstuffs, such as, for example, 5,900 seams of wheat, which amounts or equates to around 160 tons of wheat. And that highlights the challenges of provisioning Henry's army, which, like all armies, marched on its stomach, as Napoleon said, or Frederick the Great, or both. But in any case, it was true of Henry II's army as any other. So given that a winter campaign was an unusual event, fraught with potential hazards, why did Henry embark on an expedition in October 1171? A strong indication is afforded by the way in which that expedition is presented by most English chroniclers, who linked Henry's expedition directly to the activities of Strongbow in Ireland. 4 out of 6 English commentators, for example, set the scene for Henry's expedition by recounting how Strongbow had gone to Ireland and met with considerable military successes there, the most notable of which, as mentioned by Seán, was the capture of the city of Dublin. Now, Strongbow is a pivotal figure. Here's a picture of him from Gerald of Wales's Expugnatio Hibernica. He's a pivotal figure in relation to Henry's intervention in Ireland. He had been recruited by Dermot in the autumn of 1167, probably at Bristol, and probably through an introduction arranged by the urban landholder Robert Fitzharding, a suggestion that I owe to my supervisor many years ago. He said it was very likely that it was Robert Fitzharding who suggested Strongbow as a man who was in need of ready cash and might be willing to undertake intervene in Ireland. And as we heard, Strongbow was promised by, here it comes, Seán was right, there is another example of it. He was promised the marriage, the hand of his daughter Eva in marriage. This is, as Seán said, the National Library of Ireland, the National Gallery, one of the most, well, certainly the largest painting there, at any rate, let's put it that way. So that's what the deal was, or the offer in 1167. However, Strongbow proved in no hurry to go to Ireland, and Dermot had to send messengers to remind him of the commitment that he had given. When he did eventually land in August in 1170 at Waterford, he captured the city, that's the scene you have here, and immediately thereafter married Aoife. Now, this painting by Macleish is based on the narrative in Gerald of Wales' Expugnatio. The earliest fighters recruited by Dermot had arrived in Ireland in August 1167, as Seán said, with further contingents landing in May 1169 and May 1170. But those contingents, led by men such as Robert Fitzstephen and Maurice Fitzgerald, attracted no attention from contemporary English or Norman commentators, nor did their intrusion into Ireland trigger a response from Henry II. And we would know little of those first waves of intruders had it not been for the writings of their kinsman, Gerald of Wales, who argued for the crucial role of his relatives in spearheading the colonial advance into Ireland. What we might term the Geraldine prelude is ignored by contemporary English chroniclers, although the Geraldines do, of course, get coverage from Gerald of Wales, and he is the one who coins the term Geraldines. And from the other principal source, again mentioned by Seán, the Song of Dermot and the Earl, which is a vernacular poem that Professor Vincent has described as a locker room ballad, previously known as, the title previously given to it was the Song of Dermot and the Earl. The more recent title is The Deeds of the Normans in Ireland, but arguably the older title, The Song of Dermot and the Earl, better reflects the thrust and emphasis of that text, where Strongbow assumes a much more prominent role than the Geraldines do. The reason why the Geraldines didn't receive notice in English chronicles, whereas Strongbow did, is because of their differing status. Strongbow was in a different league entirely to the Geraldines. He was a substantial landholder. He had estates spread across 9 counties of England, and he also held lands in Normandy. And furthermore, he held lands directly from Henry II. The technical term would be he was a tenant-in-chief of the crown, and that brought with it commensurate obligations. So for that reason alone, Henry II would have been likely to be concerned about Strongbow's activities in Ireland. Indeed, the king sought to prevent Strongbow's departure to Ireland, as William of Newburgh, whom Seán mentioned, remarked. He claimed that the king had tried to prevent Strongbow crossing to Ireland. And William of Newburgh says persons acting on behalf of the king had tried to prevent Strongbow from sailing to Ireland. Now, there was an added reason for Henry's disquiet about Strongbow's activities in Ireland by comparison with the Geraldines, and again, Seán has alluded to it, because Strongbow had reason to be aggrieved because of the treatment that Henry II had meted out to him following his accession as king in 1154. Strongbow had succeeded his father, Gilbert, as Earl of Pembroke, and that earldom was a relatively new formation. It had been created in 1138 by King Stephen, Henry II's immediate predecessor, in the context of a civil war raging over succession to the kingship of England, and when Stephen was desperate to secure support for his cause. But when Henry II became king, he refused to acknowledge Strongbow as Earl of Pembroke, and Strongbow could justifiably feel mistreated by that deprivation, by that reduction in his patrimonial inheritance, an inheritance that he had enjoyed for a mere 6 years. As a disaffected subject on a freelance mission in Ireland, Strongbow, from Henry II's perspective, presented a potentially destabilising force across the Irish Sea. And having captured Waterford in August 1170, within a month, Strongbow had also taken the city of Dublin on the 21st of September. And given the strong trading links between Dublin and the western seaboard of Britain, and of course, especially Bristol, as we've already heard, but also Chester, this was problematic from Henry II's perspective. There is some ambiguity as to whether or not Strongbow had sought the king's permission in advance of going to Ireland. Some chroniclers say he did, others not. But certainly, after Strongbow set out for Ireland, Henry placed an embargo on travel from English ports and ordered that those of his subjects who had gone to Ireland without his permission should return by Easter 1171 or face confiscation of their property. Now, by way of coercive control, Henry could wield the threat in the case of Strongbow of seizing his lands in England and Normandy, And indeed, the king did sequestrate some of them for a period. And here you see, that is, he took them into his own hands and drew the revenue from them. And here you can see 2 entries from the Pipe Rolls, or the English Royal Exchequer records, showing the king appropriating the revenue from one of Strongbow's most important manorial estates, that of Weston in Hertfordshire. And you can see that in the first entry, that's a half year's income. In the second entry, £15, it's the income for the entire year. So Strongbow recognised the potential danger of losing all his land holdings in England and Normandy for the sake of prospective Irish acquisitions that he had not yet fully secured. And evidently, aware that Henry was planning an expedition to Ireland, he sought to negotiate in advance of the possible arrival of the king in Ireland. A Norman chronicler recorded or noted that in July 1171, at Argentan in Normandy, where the king was deliberating about an expedition to Ireland, about undertaking such an expedition, messengers arrived from Strongbow who offered to hand over to Henry the cities of Dublin, Waterford and other strongholds that Strongbow had acquired in Ireland, and to hold those lands that he gained in Ireland, to hold them under the lordship of Henry II. And indeed, it's possible to argue that Henry's involvement in Ireland was rendered inevitable by that offer of Strongbow. Notwithstanding Strongbow's proposal to acknowledge Henry's overlordship over his new acquisitions, Henry persisted with his intention to demonstrate personal overlordship in Ireland by organising an expedition. Strongbow now escalated his negotiations, judging it prudent to go and meet with Henry in person in advance of the king's arrival in Ireland, or setting out for Ireland. And he caught up with the king at Newnham in Gloucestershire in September 1171. The Welsh Chronicle, British Trysodion, recorded that Strongbow was still in the company of the king when Henry visited the Church of St. David's around the 28th of September, and that while Henry sat down to eat with the Bishop of St. David's, Strongbow had to take his meat standing. At least we know what they were eating. Henry may have sought to prevent Strongbow returning to Ireland ahead of him and deliberately retained him in his entourage. Critically, from Henry's perspective, Strongbow's activities in Ireland had not been curtailed by the Irish, as Henry might have hoped. Dermot MacMurrough had died around the 1st of May 1171. Rory O'Connor, as High King, had besieged Dublin for 3 months between June and August 1171, but had failed to dislodge Strongbow from the city. The timing of Henry's expedition to Ireland in October 1171 can therefore be explained by Strongbow's unchecked successes in Ireland, and particularly his taking of the city of Dublin, and the seriousness of that situation from Henry's perspective was such that he was prepared to take an army to Ireland, even though heading into the winter months, with all the difficulties that might bring with it. Henry was motivated by fears that the military successes of Strongbow and the king's other subjects in Ireland would create a destabilising political situation across the Irish Sea. Now, that did not, of course, preclude Henry also considering intervention in Ireland as a prospective outlook for his own political aggrandisement and for exploitation, indeed, of Ireland's economic resources, but I'll leave that to one side. Having arrived on the 17th of October 1171, what did Henry do during his 6-month stay in Ireland? Well, we know very little, as Seán said, of how he spent his time. We do know, however, that he celebrated Christmas at Dublin, where he had arrived in the city. He'd arrived in the city no later than the 10th of November, and he was still there on the 2nd of February, and he probably remained in the city until March. Now, most of these dates are taken from Roger of Howden, who, as I said, accompanied the king to Ireland. Therefore, he spent his longest period in Dublin, which was, of course, a reflection of the political and economic importance of the city. Roger of Howden, who, as we've already noted, had accompanied Henry to Ireland, described how a special feasting hall for this... See if we can do it this way, okay? A special feasting hall was erected for the celebration of Christmas, and it was constructed out of wattles with wonderful skill according to the custom of the country. It was situated beside the Church of St. Andrew the Apostle, just outside the city walls, and as Seán has argued elsewhere, the banqueting hall was almost certainly erected at the site of the Thing Mount, or Thing Moot, which was the location in the immediate pre-invasion period of the Hiberno Norse Public Assembly. And that site was chosen to signify publicly that Henry's authority had replaced that of the Hiberno Norse within the city. It was what you might call a stage-managed political, a stage-managed element of political culture or assembly politics, of public assemblies used as a means to demonstrate and reinforce authority. And we've had plenty of examples of stage-managed political events in Moscow in the last week to have some inkling of what it might mean. Now, that's just a survey made in 1682, which shows you that the Thing Moot, or the Thing Mount, was still in situ at that time. You can even see there, I can't use this thing, but there's steps. There seem to be steps going up it. So, in that context of this kind of political, stage-managed political event, it's significant that both English and Irish sources agree that Irish kings and the principal men of the country celebrated a week-long Christmas with Henry. And we even know of one item that was on the menu, namely cranes, a bird which Gerald of Wales claimed that the Irish had not been accustomed to eat until that time. So we have a form of gastronomic one-upmanship on Henry's part here. Now, erecting temporary feasting halls for important festivals was an Irish practice that is attested in both the 12th century annals and literary sources. And the most emblematic feasting hall of all was, it's described in literary sources, the Teach Mead Chuirte, or the Hall of Mead Circuits at Tara. And here we have an imaginative reconstruction of it, which is significantly contained in a 12th century manuscript, the Book of Leinster. And now I recognise that it's not in very good condition, but you can see that there is a central aisle and two rows of seating on either side of that central aisle, and it names which class of person was entitled to sit in which section. So, temporary feasting halls, known in Ireland. As for Henry II, from his perspective, Christmas was one of those solemn festivals alongside Easter and Whitsun on which the King of England wore his crown. Thus, all parties would have understood the public ceremonial significance of the occasion of Christmas, the Christmas feast of 1171. In relation to the Irish kings, Henry can be said to have scored a diplomatic success. For remarkably, the majority of Irish kings, excepting only Rory O'Connor, King of Connacht, and the kings of Tyrone and Tyrconnell in the northwest of the country, the remainder of those Irish kings voluntarily acknowledged Henry by accepting entertainment at the Christmas feast, whatever the legal implications of that may have been in either English or Irish political culture. As one contemporary source, the Munster Annals of Inishfanel, it recorded that actually the kings of Desmond and Thomond of South Munster and North Munster had actually been waiting for Henry when he landed at Waterford. So those annals had no reservations about recording the submission of those Munster kings to Henry II. More surprisingly, Henry can also be said to have scored a diplomatic success with the Irish bishops. Surprising, because clergy all over Europe had been outraged by Becket's murder. Remarkably, the Irish bishops do not seem to have had too many qualms about dealing with a king who was known to have been implicated in the murder of the primate of the English Church. Becket's murder had occurred on the 29th of December 1170, 10 months before Henry's arrival in Ireland, and that's the key point, because it afforded ample opportunity for news of the circumstances of Becket's death to have reached Ireland. According to Roger of Howden, who, as I've already said, was in Ireland with Henry II, Henry ordered the Irish bishops to meet in council at Cashel, where a series of reforming decrees was passed, although unremarked on by the Irish annals, which strongly suggests that the Council of Cashel had more significance for Henry II than for contemporaries in Ireland. Henry's influence at Cashel was mediated through his chaplain, Nicholas, and Ralph, Archdeacon of Llandaff, who was a long-serving cleric in the entourage of the king. And Roger of Howden claimed that the Irish bishops also swore oaths of loyalty to Henry II. That the bishops acquiesced to, if not welcomed, Henry's intervention in Ireland is evident from 3 letters which were addressed by Pope Alexander III on the 20th of September 1172, respectively to Henry II, the Irish bishops and the Irish kings. The Pope's letters were written 5 months after Henry's departure from Ireland, but crucially, following Henry's formal reconciliation with the Pope over Becket's murder, which had been confirmed 3 weeks earlier by the Pope on the 2nd of September. So the diplomatic context of the issue of those papal letters was important from Henry's perspective, but it was also important from the perspective of the Pope, because the Pope was as anxious as was Henry for rapprochement, since Alexander was faced with a series of anti-popes who were supported by the German emperor. So good relations with Henry II were therefore vital for Alexander. From the Pope's letter to the Irish bishops, we learn that the bishops had written letters under their own seals to Alexander. From the Pope's letter to Henry II, we learn that Alexander had received a personal account of events in Ireland from Ralph, Archdeacon of Llandaff, who had been dispatched to the papal court by Henry II. From Roger of Howden, we learn that the letters of the Irish kings were actually delivered to the Pope by Henry's envoys. And one may legitimately speculate on how much input into the drafting of those letters Henry may have had, taking into account also that the envoy, Henry's envoy to the Pope, was Ralph, Archdeacon of Llandaff, a man who was well familiar with procedures at the Curia, having previously undertaken a series of other delegations on behalf of Henry II. From Henry's standpoint, the letters of endorsement from the Irish episcopate were of immediate advantage in consolidating a papal reconciliation following Becket's murder. By representing his intervention in Ireland as serving to promote reforms within the Irish Church, Henry might demonstrate his concern for the universal Church and thereby offset some of the opprobrium from Becket's killing. Thus, in 1172, you could say that Henry was able to instrumentalise the Irish episcopate to his own advantage. Henry had been 6 months in Ireland without fighting a single battle. He departed on the 17th of April 1172, and we've already noted that he was obliged to wait weatherbound at Wexford for 2 weeks. The timing of his departure was determined by rumours that had begun to reach Ireland that papal legates had arrived in Normandy to confront Henry over Becket's murder, and that he was facing papal interdict. Additionally, his eldest son was rumoured to be colluding with his father-in-law, King Louis of France, against his own father. Excuse me. The English chronicler William of Newburgh recorded breezily that Henry, having disposed of affairs to his satisfaction, left Ireland. However, when negotiations in Normandy with the papal legates were proving intractable, Henry is said to have threatened to return to Ireland, where there was much requiring his attention. Gerald of Wales described how Henry's departure was untimely because the king had intended to fortify Ireland with castles, to settle the country in peace and stability, and altogether to mould it to his own design in the coming summer. That may, however, have been a more immediate priority for Gerald than it was for Henry. In the event, Henry, for the remainder of his reign, never expended the amount of time or resources that he had devoted to Ireland during his 6-month stay in 1171 too, although of course he was obliged to take account of events in Ireland intermittently until his death in 1189. I could give some examples of that, but I won't. During his time in Ireland, Henry had used the latent threat of force to overawe his own subjects and the Irish, rather than to launch a full-scale military campaign that would have been difficult to sustain over the winter months. And here we have Roger of Howden, who actually tells us what the difficulties were, though I don't think that his knowledge of geography was all that great, because he seems to think that there are steep mountains between the east coast and Connacht. Henry undertook no military encounters, as I say, nor I suppose you could say was he obliged to do so, because no effective armed opposition was organised against him. While the immediate effects of Henry's expedition cannot have been regarded as an unqualified success, even by the king himself, as indicated by his remark to the papal legates that he would return to Ireland where he still had much to do. Its long-term significance was, of course, to be of enormous importance for the history of Ireland and the English crown, inaugurating, as it did, an enduring constitutional link between the two countries. It's clear from contemporary negative English commentary that Henry's incursion into Ireland had generated criticism from some who regarded it as neither justified nor justifiable, arguing that it was shameful for a Christian people to be attacked by their Christian neighbours. In the case of others, however, and most notably Gerald of Wales, specious arguments were advanced to justify that invasion. Not only the falsified papal bull Laudabiliter, but also pseudo-historical justifications set in the remote past, such as that Irish kings had paid tribute to King Arthur. So to conclude then, by his personal intervention in Ireland in 1171-2, Henry II had very publicly claimed lordship over Ireland for the English crown, with momentous consequences that we are inescapably still encumbered with today, as most vividly highlighted by the ongoing outworkings of Brexit. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Flanagan. I've written down here, from dysentery to gastronomy, Henry II's winter campaign. But I think you really have evoked for us wonderfully the moment and the context in which this charter was granted. The title of our next speaker's paper is very unassuming. It is Henry II's Charter granting Dublin to Bristol, which is, I presume, what it says on the tin. But the man himself who's speaking is a very distinguished scholar, and we are privileged to have him with us today. He is also the reason why I ceased to be a friend of medieval Dublin 10 years ago, because I was the secretary, I think, of the Friends, and then Nicholas gave me a job at his university in Norwich, University of East Anglia, and I spent 2 very happy years there. And in that time really grew to understand the extent of his archival knowledge of our repositories on this island. I think it really is exceptional that an historian of primarily England and the wider Angevin dominions has spent so many years visiting and returning to our own archival resources in this country. Nicholas is the author of literally hundreds of academic papers and has a stellar reputation. In 2015, he was the face of Magna Carta 800, the 800th anniversary commemorations, and led the Academic Research Council's major project advancing Magna Carta scholarship. And since then, in 2020, he produced what I expect will be his monument, or one of them, a 6-volume edition of the Acta of Henry II plus index. I tried to count up, but I'm not good at the arithmetic, how many pages it is. I think it's over 4,000 pages in length. I presume you could also weigh it and get a sense of its scholarship just in grams and kilograms. But think about that. That's the extent of the contextual knowledge of charter scholarship that Nicholas brings to our paper today. So I welcome you, Nicholas, and thank you very much. It's a very vivid colour.
I'll do it with that. Great. Well, after that introduction, this is bound to be a disaster. So thank you very much for the invitation. And how wonderful to actually be here, to be touching those walls that, who knows, Henry II himself may have touched. Peter did point out to me that there are two 108s in that wall. So whether they're precisely in the position that they ought to be in is anyone's guess. Now, that, of course, is not Henry II's charter to Dublin. If you think of Henry II's charter, it's put on a piece of sheepskin, and you would need a very, very large sheep indeed to supply a document of that size. The thing that we're actually talking about is more like this size, a half-folded piece of A4. And that's what it looks like. We've seen it quite often so far this afternoon. What I want to do is talk about it as a physical object and its significance, both for the history of Ireland and for the history of England. You can see already, or you can hear already, that I am, as it were, the odd man out here. I obviously don't have an accent from County Cork or from roundabouts, but I think that just as it's possible for Ireland to learn something of the wider world from English historians, it's very important that we learn something of our world from your world. I'm reminded of my wife, who is herself a Dubliner, and when our eldest son was born in Canterbury, we went to the registrar to get Matthew registered, and my wife was asked where she was born, and she answered that she was born in Dublin. "Ah," said the registrar, "that's in Northern Ireland, isn't it?" So the depth of ignorance on the other side of the Irish Sea for events here is very deep indeed. So let's begin with what this charter has to tell us, as it were, from an English perspective, or at least from a Plantagenet perspective. There it is on the left, and there is my edition of it on the right. And you can see immediately that it's been many, many times published. It was first published by the great Irish antiquary Walter Harris in the 18th century, in the 1740s, and was again republished in 1768, for the first time using the original charter by Lord Lyttelton. He is the first of many chancellors of the Exchequer, we imagine, who was unable to calculate simple arithmetic. So Lord Lyttelton's History of Henry II is the first proper edition of the charter. What I hope to show you today is, quite remarkably, there are questions within this charter that have still to be posed, let alone answered. It's a charter with many mysteries. It's one, all told, Peter mentioned this monstrosity. This really is one of the fruits of COVID, because but for COVID, I wouldn't have been confined to a room where I could do nothing but mark the proofs of these 6 volumes. Henry II's Charter for Dublin is one of over 4,000 charters of Henry II that survive. And although it survives as an original, which is quite unusual, most of them survive only as copies, there are still 500 or more of these originals still extant. It would originally have been sealed with the king's seal, showing him on one side in majesty, on the other side riding into battle to conquer new lands. But the seal is lost. How then do we establish that it's an authentic charter of Henry II? Well, here the physical side of the document comes into its own, because we can look at the handwriting of the document, and thanks to T.A.M. Bishop's extraordinarily dull book, Scriptores Regis, published in 1961, it is a Stanley Gibbons, if you like, of the charters of the kings of England. Bishop went through, hand by hand, demonstrating which particular scribes wrote the documents of the Anglo-Norman and Plantagenet kings of England. So on the left, the Dublin Charter. On the right, a charter that is written in the same handwriting by a royal scribe, in this case, though, for the great abbey of St. Martin at Tours in northern France. And that charter, given current circumstances perhaps inconveniently, that charter of Henry II survives in St. Petersburg. These things have been dispersed to the 4 corners of the world. There are plenty of other instances of that hand. That's the St. Petersburg one on the left. In the background, we've got one from London. At the top, we've got another one for the monks of Bawdsley in Worcestershire. Down below, we've got a charter that grants things to Henry II. It's not in the king's name, but it's still written in the hand of this scribe. We call this scribe, with great artistry, we really build up the names of these people, we call this scribe Scribe 40. Now, Scribe 40 matters because he is one of 2 scribes, you can see there, 35 and 40, who between them wrote over 160 of the surviving 500 charters of Henry II. We actually know the name of the scribe named 35. He was called Germanus, which itself is interesting because it's not an English name, it's not a French name. It implies perhaps someone from the other side of the Rhine. What we see there, though, is that the majority of the king's business was conducted by only 2 writers at court. And that gives us some idea of the extent of royal bureaucracy. We're talking about a very small operation, including this scribe 40 who crossed from England into France, but who also crossed in 1171 into Ireland. The Dublin Charter is issued at Dublin. It gives us some idea of the limitations of court bureaucracy. So, it has real significance for our understanding of the way that government works. We learn much from this charter. Notice one other thing too. If you just look at the top line of those 2 documents, both written in the same script, you should see that there is a distinct variant between those 2 lines. The Dublin Charter begins Henricus Rex Anglorum, Henry, King of the English, Duke of the Normans and the Aquitanians and so forth. The second one begins Henricus Dei Gratia Rex Anglorum. So the Dublin Charter does not have that phrase, by God's grace, King of the English. Now that is very important, because it answers a long-standing dispute that began in the early years of the 20th century with the great diplomatist, the great historian of charters in France, Leopold de Lisle, who suggested that the Dei Gratia formula was a surefire way of dating all the original documents of Henry II. Those in the second part of his reign include Dei Gratia, those in the first part do not. One of the most horrible people ever to have worked in the field of medieval history on the right, the midget monster J.H. Round, who coxed the boat for Balliol. You imagine those vast sort of imperial consuls all rowing away for Balliol, Oxford in the late 19th century. Well, Round was the small man who sat at the end of the boat screaming at them. Round immediately answered Leopold de Lisle saying, this is nonsense, this is not the case. I know because I was there. But it turns out that de Lisle was right. Not quite in the way he supposed, though. He was unable to date precisely the introduction of the Dei Gratia clause, and the Dublin Charter enables us to do that with a degree of precision. The most effective description of all of this actually has gone completely unnoticed. It was published in 1920 by a professor at Caen called Henri Pontu. And he pointed out that the introduction of Dei Gratia, which some people have suggested was a consequence of Henry's visit to Ireland, that the introduction of Dei Gratia actually coincides with that rebellion by Henry's sons to which Marie-Thérèse has referred us. That it's in response to that rebellion by his eldest son, himself crowned king as Henry the Young King, that Henry II began to use the phrase Dei Gratia. On the left, we've got a charter of one of his sons, Henry the Young King, which doesn't include Dei Gratia. But when Henry the Young King fled to the court of Louis VII of France and was given a new seal, he adopted this new title as a symbol of his newfound authority as an independent ruler in rebellion against his father. And in the aftermath of that, Henry II began adopting this new style. Well, the Dublin Charter, unknown to de Lisle, fundamentally underlines the fact that when Henry came to Ireland in 1171-2, he was not using Dei Gratia in his style. What else can we learn from this charter? Well, we've seen it several times, and I've given you a full translation of it there, but Seán has already done that for me. I don't need to read through this text. But let's look at certain aspects of it. The first, of course, is the witness list. Witnessed by William de Breaux's, Reginald de Courtenay, Hugh de Gundeville, and these other people. Now, it is worth pointing out that there is actually a mistake there. I'm not going to risk using this pointer, but the witness list is in the plural, but it's introduced with a single formula as if it only had one witness. That's actually a mistake by the scribe. So if you want to go to the city archives and repair that mistake, I'm sure that they have individual diaries now in the age of COVID with which you can do that. But those witnesses matter because they show who accompanied the king into Ireland. And if we combine them with the other charters that Henry II issued in Ireland, we can build up that list I've marked in red there of the people that we know were with the king. Many of them go unmentioned by Gerald. We would not know that they were in Ireland but for these charters. And what is also interesting is that several of them, particularly people like Reginald de Courtenay, who later on don't seem to have acquired lands in Ireland, went on witnessing Irish business at Henry II's court. That these seem to be, as it were, the proconsuls back home, the diplomats back home, who know how Ireland works and are engaged in Irish affairs on behalf of the King of England. Then we have this rather remarkable fact, and this is why, of course, the Lord Mayor is here today from Bristol, to take back control. Remember the Brexit phrase, take back control. That's the future. We have this remarkable fact that Dublin is given to the men of Bristol. Now, this is where we begin to ask questions that really do need asking and perhaps haven't been asked very clearly in the past. That grant, as Seán said, of one town to the men of another is most unusual. It's also taken for granted that the men of Bristol, when the king refers to my men of Bristol, that we're talking about the entire inhabitants of Bristol. But Bristol itself is a rather more complicated lordship in the Middle Ages. That lower part, from where the railway station is now, Temple Meads, up to the river, is the king's. Outside the walls of that part lie the parts of Bristol that belong to the Fitzhardings, who in turn were rewarded by Henry II for the loans they'd made to him when he was trying to become king by being granted the great honour of Berkeley. North of the river, though, we have an enclave that is Bristol proper that belongs to the Earls of Gloucester. Now, the Earls of Gloucester had ambitions. They were directly descended from the English royal line. The bastard son of Henry I of England became Robert, Earl of Gloucester. That's his seal on the left, that's his coinage on the right. They both show a very royal and magnificent lion, which we assume is the symbol of his father, Henry I. But they have other symbols too. Behind the lion on the left, you'll see there's a thing that looks a bit like a flowery walking stick. And that too appears on the seal of Robert's son, who was Earl of Gloucester at the time of the invasion of 1171, William, Earl of Gloucester. We assume that that thing behind him is a rod of Jesse, a symbol of the descendants that will spring from the royal line that is to establish lordship and dominion. And those imperial pretensions are repeated on the back of the seal of William, later used by his daughter, who in turn married King John, where we've got a whole series of imperial symbols, including royal standards, imperial standards like those carried by the Romans. We've got a Roman eagle, and we've got the figure of the winged Nike, the symbol of victory within the classical world. This is a family with imperial pretensions, laying claim to the sort of posterity that we find in the biblical references to the tree of Jesse. And in that day there shall be a tree or a root or a staff of Jesse, who will stand as a banner to the people, for the Gentiles shall seek him, and his resting place shall be glorious. And you know those wonderful medieval representations of the posterity of Jesse through Mary leading on to Christ himself. The beginnings of lordship, the beginnings of the domination of the world. With those pretensions, the Earls of Gloucester must have looked askance at Henry II's claims, not only to rule Bristol, but in due course to grant Dublin to his men of Bristol, rather than to the Earl of Gloucester's Bristol. And we can see that in what unfolded, a very rapid deterioration in relations between Henry II and the Earls of Gloucester, the owners of Bristol. In the rebellion that followed his time in Ireland, the Earl of Gloucester wavered, did not come down on either side. In 1176, nonetheless, the king effectively seized the daughter of the Earl of Gloucester and married her off to his youngest son, the future King John. And William, Earl of Gloucester, died a few years later in disgrace, quite possibly in captivity, whereafter John and Isabella, the daughter of William, were properly married in 1189, and John scooped Bristol as part of his inheritance. In other words, within that idea of the Tree of Jesse, the ultimate victor here was John, King John of England. Now, there are a number of themes to emerge from that. Perhaps the most interesting, which really I've only just begun to think about this afternoon, is the whole question of why on earth have you got that charter? Surely it should go back with the Lord Mayor to Bristol. You may not want to give him Stephen's Green, but you can at least give him that small piece of old sheep. It must originally have been in the archives of Bristol. It's granted to the men of Bristol. How did it end up here? Well, presumably it was used by the Bristolians in Dublin. They wanted it. It showed that they had rights to the city. And it remained here after the 1190s, when that connection began to fray. The connection frayed because John, now established as Lord of Bristol, no longer had to do favours to the Bristolians. They were fully under his authority. So in the early 1190s, he granted independent charters to the men of Dublin, now treated as an independent unity, and to the men of Bristol. Both communities acquired independent status. But that explains why that document is still here, because the men of Dublin held on to it once they became the men of Dublin rather than the men of Bristol dwelling in Dublin. And all of that as the outcome of this destiny for the Earls of Gloucester through King John, now united to the royal line in England. That business of the Jesse tree, though, also reminds us that from 1171 onwards, the kings of England supposed that they had an imperial destiny. We see that in those papal letters that Marie-Thérèse referred to. In 1172, the Pope writes to the king that the king has now extended, Henry, you have extended the power of your serenity against that barbaric and indisciplined people, miraculously and magnificently triumphing over that realm which the princes of Rome, the world's victors, left unvisited. In other words, Henry had done something that the Roman emperors of antiquity had failed to do. He'd taken Ireland. And that led on, immediately after Henry's return and the reconciliation with the church, to a whole series of imperial symbolisms in 1173, where the king travelled as far south as Clermont-Ferrand, on the frontiers with Italy, married his son, John, off to, at this stage, an Italian heiress, the rulers of Savoy, with Turin within their sights, and planned a great expedition against heresy in southern France. It was as an outcome of all of that sort of negotiation, where Henry II is posing very much as the successor to King Arthur, as an imperial conqueror, now crossing the sea to conquer the whole of Europe, perhaps as far south beyond the Alps as Rome. It's in reaction to that that Henry's sons rebelled in 1173. So Dublin matters, both for Henry's government, for Henry's ideas of empire, and for the collapse of at least some of those ideas in that rebellion of 1173. Then we come to another point that Seán drew attention to. And remember, this is a very well-known document, but like so many things that are well-known, it is so easily taken for granted. It claims to grant to my men of Bristol, that small enclave of royal authority in Bristol, Dublin, to dwell there ad inhabitandum, and that they inhabit that place, that they should inhabitant that place. Now, most royal charters do not take that form. Certainly in England, this is, as far as I'm aware, unique. What we tend to get in parts of the world where expansion is occurring, where new imperial conquests are being made, what we tend to get is the grant of free city status to newly established towns, most famously, of course, in the Baltic, with this great succession of ports going further north from Hamburg, Lübeck, Danzig, Riga, all the way up to Novgorod. We get the Christianization of this region through the establishment of free cities. The free cities may be given the customs of their predecessors, so that Danzig may get the customs of Hamburg, but they are independent entities. They're not given to one another. The exception here is the Holy Land, the land of Christ, the Holy Land of Jerusalem, where after the First Crusade, a series of Italian merchant states, Venice, Pisa, and Genoa, were indeed given parts or whole cities in the East to colonize. That's the imperial colonies of the city of Genoa by the 15th century. They matter enormously, even that stuff up in the Crimea, where our focus is very much today. They matter because, in a sense, that's where all bad things came from in the 1340s. That's where the Black Death first entered Europe, by Genoese merchants returning through the Bosphorus back to Italy, spreading the plague with them as they went. That's an optimistic note to bear in mind, given what's going on there, even as I speak. Those colonies of the Genoese in the east included whole grants of towns. So here we are in 1104 with the King of Jerusalem, Baldwin I, granting the Genoese, that's Genoa above, granting them land in the city of Jerusalem and in Jaffa, but also granting them a third of the city of Caesarea, a third of the city of Acre, and should I conquer it, Baldwin says, with the aid of the Genoese, a third of Cairo itself. Now that, if I may say so, I think is the model for your charter. We're a long way here from Genoa, let alone from Cairo. But we know that that grant to the men of Genoa of a third of the city of Acre was plastered all over the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. There's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, both where Christ was crucified and died and was resurrected. It covers all of those sites. We know that because a golden inscription was put up in the dome decreeing that the men of Genoa were to hold a third in future of the city of Acre. And we know that because in the late 1160s, the Pope was petitioned by the Genoese to restore that golden inscription that the kings of Jerusalem had allowed to fade. Here we are, only a year or so before Henry's charter to Dublin, in a world with very much the same symbols, with very much the same gestures. Now, all of that, of course, fits into the wider context of Henry's imagined crusade against the Irish. Henry, who was pilloried as the murderer of Becket, came to Ireland, in part at least, with the rhetoric of religion backing up his conquest. We find that even in Laudabilitaire, and I agree entirely with Marie-Thérèse that Laudabilitaire is a text much tampered with, but that as a Christian prince, it is Henry's duty to restore Ireland to proper Christian worship. We find it in the papal letters of 1172, where Henry is told that in remission of his sins, he has restored Ireland to Christianity. We find it in his charters issued shortly after his expedition to Ireland, where he brings the Templars into Ireland as an instrument of English royal authority. And the Templars, whose own role is to defend the Holy Land of Jerusalem, now being brought into Ireland as an instrument of Plantagenet power. We find it, as Marie-Thérèse said, in that whole running down of the Irish as an unchristian people who had to be brought back to the proper worship of Christ. We find it in members of the expeditionary force of Strongbow, claiming to fight in the name of the cross against the Irish. We find it slightly later in the absurd claim of Gervase of Tilbury, but a claim that comes directly from the Plantagenet court, that Ireland was the last country to adopt the true religion and did so then only under compulsion. Now, all of that fits in with that phraseology of Henry's charter and that particularly peculiar phrase, ad inhabitandum, that Bristol is to have Dublin ad inhabitandum, which takes us in turn into the world of the Bible, the language of the Bible, and very appropriately here, we're literally a stone's throw away from the site of the first performance of Handel's Messiah in the new music hall in Fishamble Street in 1742. Well, those of you who know the Messiah, it begins, "Comfort ye my people." And that passage of Isaiah, we've already seen Isaiah on Jesse, includes the phrase that God himself will give to inhabit in their tents the land so that the people may multiply and fructify. But I want to end on, as it were, a darker note, or perhaps not so dark a note. The document on the left is the next charter of Dublin. We celebrate the Henry Charter, but Henry's son, John, renewed that charter in 1185, and there it is on the left. But the original of that charter, the piece of parchment itself, is generally unknown. That document has been published many times, but always from later copies. It includes all those phrases about Dublin and Bristol becoming the owner, in effect, of Dublin to inhabit. We heard earlier on of the custody of Dublin city charters, of the 102 charters that still survive in the Pearse Street repository. Well, that one, I'm sorry to tell you, isn't in Pearse Street. It's in the National Library of Ireland, and I came upon it really by happenstance, by the fact that Peter Crooks allowed me to see a file card index that generally isn't available, including a whole series of acquisitions by the library in the 1950s that are very little known. How did it get to the National Library from Pearse Street? Well, it went by an extraordinary route. It was removed from there by a historian, William Charles Monk Mason, who in the early years of the 19th century worked as hereditary land waiter for exports in the Dublin Revenue Office. That's a sinecure, and who in 1826, as a sinecurist, was abolished. His office was abolished, so he went to live in England. And he took with him, we assume, that Dublin City Charter, the second of your city's charters. Monk Mason himself is a fairly mysterious figure. He's often confused wrongly with another Mason, William Shaw Mason. We're talking about William Charles Monk Mason. And when I went online to try and find an image of him, I couldn't find him, but I did find this portrait, rather fine portrait, by Hugh Douglas Hamilton, sold a few years ago for £15,000, which is said to be his wife. But as the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography says he didn't have a wife, I'm not quite sure how inventive the Christie's valuation has been. We do, however, have the catalogue of the sale of William Monk Mason's archives and library in 1858. And this was a sale in London at Sotheby's, and you can see lot 451 is a charter of King Henry I to Battle Abbey. 452 is the charter of John, Lord of Ireland, confirming the grant of the city of Dublin to Bristol. And the note there suggests that this must have come out of the Bristol archive because, like me, the cataloguer in 1858 is rather surprised that that document is in Dublin rather than Bristol. It passed in 1858 by sale to this monstrous figure, Sir Thomas Phillips, who built up the greatest collection of medieval manuscripts ever assembled. And Phillips himself wrote on the back of that charter, now in the National Library, 33747 Phillips manuscripts is mine. So we know from that it was in Phillips' library. So it went from Dublin City through Monk Mason's perhaps not entirely clean hands, into auction in London and then to Sir Thomas Phillips, and returned to Dublin, we think, round about 1950, probably from one of the sales of Phillips' manuscripts. Now, over the last couple of days, I've been looking here for other manuscripts that were in that Monk Mason sale, and there are several of them that I've turned up even over the last couple of days. This is in the National Archives of Ireland. This too was a Phillips manuscript, but it's in Monk Mason's hands, and it's in the sale catalogue of 1858. But there are other things that we would dearly like to know the whereabouts of. 459 there turned up this morning in the National Library. That's one of the additional charters in the National Library today, and again passed through Phillips. But what about 457, letters patent of Edward III to the Mayor of the City of Dublin, granting pardon for all murders, robberies and other offences committed, dated at Cork? That's completely disappeared. Since its sale for 16 shillings, which isn't very much money even back in 1858, to a dealer called Parker. We would dearly like to recover that. That's perhaps a dark note on which to end, so I won't end on a dark note, I'll end on a light note, indeed a note created entirely by light. You all know that a large part of the Irish documentary heritage was destroyed in the early 1920s in the Four Courts fire. And with that fire went up all of the early deeds of Christchurch Cathedral, all of the early deeds of early English rule in Dublin. But miraculously, some of them survive. Marie-Therese drew my attention last year, annoyingly, just after I published an edition of this text, supposed to be definitive, saying that the original was lost, drew my attention to these glass plates that were made for photographic display in old-style lantern slides, now in the Royal Society of Antiquaries of Ireland. And there we have the text of Henry II's original charter that was burnt in the 1920s, but that still burns bright in terms of its photographic reproduction. So for all of those reasons, that charter has a lot to teach us even now, and poses many questions that I hope will go on being answered for at least the next 800 years. Thank you very much.
Good show, and that was certainly a very, very exciting, spellbinding even presentation. It put the charter in its broadest possible context, but also showed us what a real master can do with archival evidence. So thank you so much for that. We are over time, Caoimhe. Can we take some questions? Yeah. We do have time. We'll be given a little moment to interrogate our speakers. I don't know if Seán Duffy is close by, but Seán, yeah, great. So if you would like to come this way, because you'll have to speak to the mic, are there questions that people would like to pose? I'll start with Brendan Smith. It's nice to recognise Brendan, who is a Dubliner, but also now a Bristolian at the University of Bristol. Brendan, yeah. Go ahead and ask.
This one's from the heart, I suppose. Seán and Grace, are we in danger of imagining that the charter is, in a sense, the start of a story, when in fact it's merely a snapshot of something that's already been developing? In other words, do you think there were merchants, Bristol merchants already operating in Dublin before 1171, before 1167?
I think I just have to repeat the question, do it, so it goes to anyone who's watching on Facebook. Brendan's question is about whether this charter is the start of the story or part of a process with a longer history. I'll let Grace or Seán answer.
I know nothing about this. Obviously, Brendan, just to say I'm thrilled to see you with us here this evening. Brendan, absolutely fabulous to have you. I mean, as you know, Bristol was only emerging from the shadow of Chester, I think, in the century leading up to the issuing of this charter. So what evidence we have of Dublin's mercantile relations across the water before this is sometimes it's as heavy in favour of Chester as it is Bristol. But it has to be the case that there were very close connections between Bristol and Dublin, and presumably residents, back and forth. And they will from the Dublin perspective, they will be forever impossible lost to us, I imagine, for want of records. I mean, there's hardly a single document that survives from Dublin before 1170. Hardly anything. It's all indirect. So, whereas there are some for Bristol, and so maybe it might be possible to trace there. For the most part, we are reliant on archaeological evidence. And there's quite a lot of archaeological evidence that would suggest the presence of materials from Bristol or the general Bristol area that predate the Anglo-Norman invasion. We have a few archaeologists in the audience, so they would know more about this than me. But sometimes, in the absence of documentation, archaeology presents the answer. And I would think, I mean, you presumably agree that that's likely to have been the case. These contacts are likely to have existed.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think the slave trade must have involved Bristolians coming to Dublin to purchase slaves, and vice versa, probably. Dublin merchants coming to Bristol to the first phase of Bristol's slave trade. Yes, gave it its initial prosperity.
All I was going to add was that I think even the simple proximity of the two cities to each other, as you said, the slave trade, you mentioned in your talk about Woolston and his condemnation of, his very famous condemnation of the Irish being involved in the slave trade, and how he warned English people, if you were hanging around a port, be careful if you saw Irish people, because they'd whip you up on a ship back over to Ireland, so be very careful. And again, as you said, this was later then used as kind of a justification for the colonisation of Ireland, that we were so godless and awful that it was about time that someone arrived in and showed us the way. But no, I think what I would think about the Charter is, I think reiterating what you said in your talk, Seán, was that I think it took the risk of maybe a big move to Dublin away for Bristolians. I don't think in any way that Dublin was new at all to Bristol merchants. I would think there were probably some who knew the city very well, and vice versa. But I think for maybe investing in Dublin, for taking that real kind of financial risk, and think, I bang on about kind of the personal and think about the individuals and the impact on it. Think about the actual financial risk that you would take as a merchant to come to Dublin and start buying property, investing in property. And I think maybe that's something the Charter did, that it took some of that financial risk away from you.
Thank you very much indeed. There's a question here.
Yeah, sorry, just two brief questions, two very unacademic questions, I have to say. But yes, one of the speakers mentioned Crocker Street, and I was just wondering if there are any streets in Dublin that were, the same name, where they called after streets in Bristol. The other thing I was very interested in was the accent at the time. There must have been native Dubliners born to Bristolian or Bristolian heritage. Would they have inherited the Bristolian accent, and could that have been a foundation to the present accent? I wonder if they
So, thanks. A question about street names and common street names, and is the Dublin accent from Bristol?
I'll go with the first. I'll go with the first question. I'm on more solid ground with the first question. There is perhaps a little bit more evidence for Chester with Werburg. Isn't St. Werburg? Isn't she at Chester? Yeah. So St. Werburg Street across the street from us here. So that perhaps gives it. Oh, okay. But there is in Bristol, I'd have to double check, but in the 14th century maybe, there's an area called Irish Mead, which interests me. Now, maybe Brendan, you might know.
Yeah, it's mentioned before 1170.
Okay. So again, I think the presence, and there's a lot of throughout the 13th, 14th, 15th century, there's a lot of mentions of Irish people in Bristol, and reminding, I think there's ones like reminding people you shouldn't really be hiring Irish people as your servants, and kind of keep jobs at home sort of, idea. As regards Bristol names in Dublin, I can't think of.
Not in terms of streets.
No, not in terms of street names. The Irish Mead in Bristol is the only one that, off the top of my head, kind of ties in with what you were saying.
I mean, and I said the accent, and we wouldn't have a clue. I mean, you can't possibly trace those kinds of things, and even the Dublin accent in 2022 is different from the Dublin accent of 50 years ago.
And don't forget as well, like Dublin was a very cosmopolitan city. There were traders from all over, what we'd call Europe. So you'd have heard a lot of different accents and a lot of different languages being spoken.
I'm hoping for a question for the second panel. Are there any? I can see some hands up. But,
big shots, rather than.
Are there any? Yeah. You go ahead, please. Yeah.
Are there any corresponding records in Bristol that show that Bristol derived benefit, or by issuing licenses, or that the city derived some benefits from this grant that they had for a while?
It's an interesting question about Bristol's records. Brent?
I think there is, really.
Yes, let's do that.
What's interesting there is just the disappearance of Dublin from the Bristol records. So we've got these first two charters, the Henry II one, the John one, in which Dublin is given to Bristol. And the next we read in the early 1190s, Bristol has its own constitution, it has its own liberties and so on, but not a mention of Dublin. So this business just drops out completely. I mean, there are obviously in the Bristol archives, and I'd have to say actually the Bristol archives aren't in many ways as rich as the archives of Dublin. They're both pretty rich archives, but this one is especially rich. We don't, for instance, have anything like that roll of the gold. We don't have anything like that for Bristol as early as this. But there isn't anything really specifically that I can think of that is a Dublin connection. There are references to Irish trade, particularly later on, but nothing immediate.
But I mean, it is true, of course, and Brendan has written about this and has well documented the ongoing connections between the two cities and the importance of Dubliners in later medieval Bristol. I think this gentleman was next.
I was just curious, is there ever a point where the Bristolians in Dublin develop a separate identity to both, their Bristolian counterparts at home and then also Englishness in general? Because I recall during the arrival of Edward III's son, Lionel Duke of Clarence, to govern Ireland, he actually didn't let any Irish-born English heritage or not persons near his camp or to converse with him. And I believe it might have been the same account or a contemporaneous one that described the English spoken in Dublin and the Irish colonies as almost bastard English.
There's a question of the divergence between the settlers in Ireland and their brethren back at home. That account that you referred to from the 1360s is written by a Dubliner, the prior of the Dominicans. Nicholas, do you have anything you want to say from your period about that?
Well, about my personal experience, we live in France, so we are not French, and we are not English, and we're not Irish. My wife's family is Irish. I think it's the lot of the colonists throughout history that you're not quite sure what you are. In England, you're not regarded as English, but you're not regarded as Irish in Ireland. So you live in this peculiar demi-mondaine.
And that is a sentiment in Gerald of Wales, isn't it? That's expressed. Yep. I think we will have to end there, but thank you to the people who've posed questions. Huge thanks to the speakers. My own thanks to the Mayor of Bristol. Can I just pass to Caoimhe Whelan? Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Seán. To close us up. Caoimhe, hand to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And thank you for two wonderful panels. It's been so fascinating to hear about the connections between Ireland and Bristol and connections between the English crown and Dublin and the invasion of the 1170s and the personal intervention of Henry II in Ireland that Professor Marie-Therese Flanagan and Professor Seán Duffy spoke about. The connections, the networks of the people in Dublin and Bristol 850 years ago that Dr. Grace O'Keefe outlined for us, and of course Professor Nick Vinson's examination of the paleography and of the Charter and its context. And really, I just want to thank all of them for being here and for sharing their scholarship with us and being in person, which I think was, certainly I enjoyed it. I hope everybody else did as well. So. Just want to say another quick few thank yous to the Deputy Lord Mayor of Dublin for opening our seminar today. A huge thank you for the Lord Mayor of Bristol for being with us and for joining us for the whole event, and I hope you enjoyed the proceedings. To our colleagues in the Dublin City Libraries and Archives, we want to thank Brendan Teeling and Angela Cassidy, who've worked with us to make this whole thing possible. Huge thank you to them for organising to have this replica of the Charter on display, and for organising the catering and the use of this wonderful venue with this splendid medieval backdrop of the city wall. And I'm delighted to remind everybody that Dublin City Council recently had a lengthy, complicated process of repointing it, so it will be preserved for the future, so they are to be commended on that. Also, just thank you to the Wood Quay staff, our videographer, Dave Knox of No Name Video and his team, to our chairs for the sessions, Dr. Peter Crooks and Dr. Sparker Booker, and thanks to the Friends of Medieval Dublin backroom team that have been helping us prepare for this event. Dr. Anya Foley, Daryl Henley Roonley, Dawn Zimmer-Kloss and Patrick Herbage. And finally, I want to just have a note of thanks to Professor Seán Duffy, who's chairman of the Friends of Medieval Dublin and familiar to many of you here, who's been working with me and our colleagues in the Dublin City Library and Archives to make this event possible. Without Seán, this wouldn't have taken place. He's done tremendous work behind the scenes, so thank you to him. So I hope you have enjoyed the tour de force of historical scholarship that we've been treated to today. I think we've had about 170 people tuned in, both with people that are present and also online, which is fantastic. So thank you all for being here, either in person or online, and I hope you've enjoyed. If you do want to join our mailing list, send us an email. I have some cards on the table with the email address if you'd like to send a message, or you'll find us on the website as well. And just finally to flag that there is a connected event which was organised by Professor Brendan Smith in Bristol, which will be on something that the Deputy Lord Mayor mentioned earlier, on the age of Edmund Burke. And he will be in communication about this, and we will be in communication with you about that. So hopefully some of you might be able to join that either in person or maybe online. So once again, just thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you at another Friends of Medieval Dublin very soon.